Chapter 18 of The Outlet by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Little Missouri. A week later we crossed the Belle Fourche, sometimes called the North Fork of the Big Cheyenne. Like its twin sister on the south, it was a mountain river, having numerous affluents putting in from the Black Hills, which it encircled on the north and west. Between these two branches of the mother stream were numerous tributaries, establishing it as the best watered country encountered in our long overland cruise. Besides the splendid watercourses which marked that section, numerous wagon trails leading into the hills were peopled with freighters. Long ox trains, moving at a snail's pace, crept over hill and plain, the common carrier between the mines and the outside world. The fascination of the primal land was there. The buttes stood like sentinels, guarding a king's domain, while the palisaded cliffs frowned down, as if erected by the hand omnipotent to mark the boundary of nations. Our route, after skirting the Black Hills, followed up the Belle Fourche a few days, and early in August we crossed over to the Little Missouri River. The divide between the Belle Fourche and the latter stream was a narrow one, requiring little time to graze across it, and intercepting the Little Missouri somewhere in Montana. The course of that river was almost due north, and crossing and recrossing it frequently, we kept constantly in touch with it on our last northward track. The river led through sections of country now known as the Bad Lands, but we found an abundance of grass and an easy passage. Sponsilier held the lead all the way down the river, though I did most of the advanced scouting, sometimes being as much as 50 miles in front of the herds. Near the last of the month we sighted Sentinel Butte and the smoke of railroad trains, and a few days later all three of us foremen rode in to Little Missouri Station of the Northern Pacific Railway. Our arrival was expected by one man at least, for as we approached the straggling village our employer was recognized at a distance, waving his hat, and a minute later all three of us were shaking hands with Don Lovell. Mutual inquiries followed, and when we reported the cattle fine as silk, having never known a hungry or thirsty hour after leaving the North Platte, the old man brightened and led the way to a well-known saloon. "How did I fare at Omaha?" said old man Don, repeating Forrest's query. Well, at first it was a question if I would be hung or shot, but we came out with colors flying. The United States Marshal who attempted to take possession of the cattle on the North Platte went back on the same train with us. He was feeling sore over his defeat, but Sutton cultivated his acquaintance, and in mollifying that official showed him how easily failure could be palmed off as a victory. In fact, I think Mike overcolored the story at my expense. He and the marshal gave it to the papers, and the next morning it appeared in the form of a sensational article. According to the report, a certain popular Federal officer had gone to Ogallala to take possession of 2 herds of cattle intended for government purposes. He met with resistance by a lot of Texas roughs, who fatally shot one of his deputies, wounding several others and killing a number of horses during the assault. But the intrepid officer had added to his laurels by arresting the owner of the cattle and leader of the resisting mob, and had brought him back to face the charge of contempt in resisting service. The papers freely predicted that I would get the maximum fine, and one even went so far as to suggest that imprisonment might teach certain arrogant cattle kings a salutary lesson. But when the hearing came up, Sutton placed Jim Reed and me in the witness box, taking the stand later himself, and we showed that federal court that it had been buncoed out of an order of injunctive relief in favor of the biggest set of ringsters that ever missed stretching hemp. The result was I walked out of that federal court scot-free, and Judge Dundy, when he realized the injustice that he had inflicted made all three of us take dinner with him, fully explaining the pressure which had been brought to bear at the time the order of relief was issued. Oh, that old judge was all right. I only hope we have as square a man as Judge Dundy at the final hearing at Fort Buford. Do you see that sign over there where it says barley water and bad cigars? Well, put your horses in some corral and meet me there. There was a great deal of news to review. Lovell had returned to Ogallala. The body of Tolleston had been recovered and given decent burial. Delivery day of the 3 Indian herds was at hand, bringing that branch of the season's drive to a close. But the main thing which absorbed our employer was the quarantine that the upper Yellowstone country proposed enforcing against through Texas cattle. He assured us that had we gone by way of Wyoming and down the Powder River, the chances were that the local authorities would have placed us under quarantine until after the first frost. He assured us that, the year before, Texas fever had played sad havoc among the native and wintered southern cattle, and that Miles City and Glendive, livestock centers on the Yellowstone, were up in arms in favor of a rigid quarantine against all through cattle. If this proved true, it was certainly an ill wind to drovers on the Powder River route, yet I failed to see where we were benefited until my employer got down to details. "That's so," said he. "I forgot to tell you boys that when Reed and I went back to Ogallala, we found Field, Radcliffe and Company buying beeves. Yes, they had bought a remuda of horses, rigged up 2 wagons, and hired men to take possession of our Open A and Drooping T herds. But meeting with disappointment and having the outfit on their hands, they concluded to buy cattle and go ahead and make the delivery at Buford. They simply had to do it or admit that I had called their hands. But Reed and I raised such a howl around that town that we posted every man with beeves for sale until the buyers had to pony up cash for every hoof they bought. We even hunted up young Murnane, the seller of the herd that Jim Reed ran the attachment on. And before old Jim and I got through with him, we had his promise not to move out of Keith County until the last dollar was in hand. The buyers seem to command all kinds of money, but where they expect to make anything, even if they do deliver, beats me, as Reed and I have got a good wad of their money. Since leaving there, I have had word that they settled with Murnane, putting a new outfit with the cattle, and that they have 10,000 beef steers on the way to Fort Buford this very minute. They are coming through on the North Platte and Powder River route, and if quarantine can be enforced against them until frost falls, it will give us a clear field at Buford on the day of delivery. Now it stands to us in hand to see that those herds are isolated until after the 15th day of September." The atmosphere cleared instantly. I was well aware of the ravages of splenic fever, but 2 decades ago every drover from Texas denied the possibility of a through animal in perfect health giving a disease to wintered Southerners or domestic cattle, also robust and healthy. Time has demonstrated the truth, yet the manner in which the germ is transmitted between healthy animals remains a mystery to this day, although there has been no lack of theories advanced. Even the theorists differ as to the manner of germ transmission, the sporule, tick, and ship fever being the leading theories, each having its advocates. The latter was entitled to some consideration, for if bad usage and the lack of necessary rest, food, and water will produce fever aboard immigrant steamships, the same privations might do it among animals. The overdriving of trail cattle was frequently unavoidable, dry drives and the lack of grass on arid waste being a common occurrence. However, the presence of fever among through cattle was never noticeable to the practical man, and if it existed, it must have been very mild in form compared to its virulent nature among natives. Time has demonstrated that it is necessary for the domestic animals to walk over and occupy the same ground to contract the disease, though they may drink from the same trough or stream of water, or inhale each other's breath in play across the wire fence without fear of contagion. A peculiar feature of Texas fever was that the very cattle which would impart it on their arrival after wintering in the North would contract it and die the same as natives. The isolation of herds on a good range for a period of 60 days, or the falling of frost, was recognized as the only preventive against transmitting the germ. Government rewards and experiments have never demonstrated a theory that practical experience does not dispute. The only time on this drive that our attention had been called to the fever alarm was on crossing the wagon trail running from Pierre on the Missouri River to the Black Hills. I was in the lead when a large bull train was sighted in our front, and shortly afterward the wagon boss met me and earnestly begged that I allow his outfit to pass before we crossed the wagon road. I knew the usual form of ridicule of a herd foreman, but the boss bull-whacker must have anticipated my reply, for he informed me that the summer before he had lost 90 head out of 200 yoke of oxen. The wagon master's appeal was fortified by a sincerity which won his request, and I held up my cattle and allowed his train to pass in advance. Sponsilier's herd was out of sight in my rear, while Forrest was several miles to my left and slightly behind me. The wagon boss rode across and made a similar request of Forrest, but that worthy refused to recognize the right-of-way to a bull train at the expense of a trail herd of government beeves. Ungentlemanly remarks are said to have passed between them, when the boss bull-whacker threw down the gauntlet and galloped back to his train. Forrest pushed on, with ample time to have occupied the road in crossing, thus holding up the wagon train. My herd fell to grazing, and Sponsilier rode up to inquire the cause of my halting. I explained the request of the wagon master, his loss the year before, and present fear of fever, and called attention to the clash which was imminent between the long freight outfit in our front and Forrest's herd to the left, both anxious for the right-of-way. A number of us rode forward in clear view of the impending meeting. It was evident that Forrest would be the first to reach the freight road, and would naturally hold it while his cattle were crossing it. But when this also became apparent to the bull train, the lead teams drove out of the road and halted, the rear wagons passing on ahead, the two outfits being fully a mile apart. There were about 20 teams of 10 yoke each, and when the first 5 or 6 halted, they unearthed old needle rifles and opened fire across Forrest's front. Once the range was found, these long-range buffalo guns threw up the dust in handfuls in the lead of the herd, and Forrest turned his cattle back while the bull train held its way undisputed. It was immaterial to Forrest who occupied the road first, and with the jeers of the freighters mingled the laughter of Sponsilier and my outfit as John Quincy Forrest reluctantly turned back. This incident served as a safety valve, and whenever Forrest forged to the lead in coming down the Little Missouri, all that was necessary to check him was to inquire casually which held the right-of-way, a trail herd or a bull train. Throughout the North, Texas fever was generally accepted as a fact, and anyone who had ever come in contact with it once dreaded it ever afterwards. So when the devil was sick, the devil a monk would be, and if there was any advantage in taking the contrary view to the one entertained by all drovers, so long as our herds were free, we were not like men who could not experience a change of opinion, if in doing so the wind was tempered to us. Also, in this instance, we were fighting an avowed enemy, and all is fair in love and war. And amid the fumes of bad cigars, Sponsilier drew out the plan of a campaign. "Now let's see," said old man Don. "Tomorrow will be the 25th day of August. I've got to be at the Crow Agency a few days before the 10th of next month, As you know, we have a delivery there on that date. Flood will have to attend to matters at Rosebud on the 1st, and then hurry on west to be present at Paul's delivery at Fort Washakie. So you see, I'll have to depend on two of you boys going up to Glendive and Miles and seeing that those cow towns take the proper view of this quarantine matter. After dinner you'll fall back and bring up your herds, and after crossing the railroad here, the outfit will graze over to Buford. We'll leave 4 of our best saddle horses here in pasture, so as to be independent on our return. Since things have changed so, the chances are that I'll bring Bob Quirk back with me, as I've written Flood to help the rebel sell his remuda and take the outfit and go home. Now you boys decide among yourselves which two of you will go up the Yellowstone and promote the enforcement of the quarantine laws. Don't get the impression that you can't do this, because an all-around cowman can do anything where his interests are at stake. I'll think the program out a little more clearly by the time you bring up the cattle. The herds were not over 15 miles back up the river when we left them in the morning. After honoring the village of Little Missouri with our presence for several hours, we saddled up and started to meet the cattle. There was no doubt in my mind but that Sponsilier would be one of the two to go on the proposed errand of diplomacy, as his years, experience, and good solid sense entitled him to outrank either Forrest or myself. I knew that Quince would want to go, if for no other reason than to get out of working the few days that yet remained of the drive. All 3 of us talked the matter of quarantine freely as we rode along, yet no one ventured any proposition looking to an agreement as to who should go on the diplomatic mission. I was the youngest, and naturally took refuge behind my years, yet perfectly conscious that, in spite of the indifferent and nonchalant attitude assumed, all 3 of us foremen were equally anxious for the chance. Matters remained undecided, but the next day at dinner, Lovell having met us before reaching the railroad, the question arose who should go up to Miles City. Dave and Quince were also eating at my wagon, and when our employer forced an answer, Sponsilier innocently replied that he supposed that we were all willing to leave it to him. Forrest immediately approved of Dave's suggestion. I gave my assent, and old man Don didn't qualify, hedge, or mince his words in appointing the committee to represent the firm of Lovell. Jealous of each other, ain't you? Very well. I want these herds grazed across to Buford at the rate of 4 miles a day. Nothing but a Mexican pastor or a white man as lazy as Quince Forrest can fill the bill. You're listening, are you, Quince? Well, after sunsets tonight, you're in charge of 10,000 beeves from here to the mouth of the Yellowstone. I want to put every ounce possible on those steers for the next 20 days. We may have to make a comparison of cattle, and if we should, I want ours to lay over the opposition like a double eagle does over a lead dime. We may run up against a lot of red tape at Fort Buford, but if there's a lick of cow sense among the government representatives, we want our beeves to speak for themselves. Fat animals do their own talking. You remember when everyone was admiring the fine horse, the blind man said, "Isn't he fat?" Now, Dave, you and Tom appoint your segundos, and we'll all catch the 10:20 train west tonight. I dared to risk one eye on Forrest. Inwardly I was chuckling, but Quince was mincing along with his dinner, showing the languid indifference which is inborn to the Texan. Lovell continued to monopolize the conversation, blowing on the cattle and ribbing up Forrest to see that the beeves thenceforth should never know tire, hunger, or thirst. The commissaries had run low. Sponsilier's cook had been borrowing beans from us for a week past, while Parent point-blank refused to share any more of our bacon. The latter was recognized as a staple in trail work, and it mattered not how inviting the beef or venison might be, we always fell back to bacon with avidity. When it came time to move out on the evening lap, Forrest's herd took the lead, the other two falling in behind, the wagons pulling out for town in advance of everything. Jack Splann had always acted as segundo in my absence, and as he had overheard Lovell's orders to Forrest, there was nothing further for me to add, and Splann took charge of my open A's. When changing mounts at noon, I caught two of my best saddlers and tied one behind the chuck wagon to be left with the liveryman in town. Leaving old man Don with the cattle, all three of us foremen went into the village in order to secure a few staple supplies with which to complete the journey. It can be taken for granted that Sponsilier and myself were feeling quite gala. The former took occasion as we rode along to throw several bouquets at Forrest over his preferment, and when the latter turned on us saying, "You fellows think you're damn smart, now don't you? You're both pretty good talkers, but neither one of you can show me where the rainbow comes in riding along with these measly cattle. It's enough to make a man kick his own dog. But I can see where the old man was perfectly right in sending you two up to Miles City. When you fellows work your rabbit's foot, it will be Katy with those Washington City schemers. More than likely, they'll not draw cards when they see that you are in the game. When it comes to the real sabe, you fellows shine like a tree full of owls. Honest, it has always been a wonder to me that Grant didn't send for both of you when he was making up his cabinet." The herds crossed a railroad about a mile west of Little Missouri Station. The wagons secured the needed supplies and pulled out down the river, leaving Sponsilier and myself footloose and free. Lovell was riding a livery horse, and as neither of us expected him to return until it was too dark to see the cattle, we amused ourselves by looking over the town. There seemed to be a great deal of freighting to outlying points, numerous ox and mule trains coming in and also leaving for their destinations. Our employer came in about dusk, and at once went to the depot as he was expecting a message. One had arrived during his absence, and after reading it, he came over to Dave and me, saying, "It's from Mike Sutton. I authorized him to secure the services of the best lawyer in the West, and he has just wired me that he has retained Senator Asprain of Sioux City, Iowa. They will report at Fort Buford on September the 5th, and will take care of any legal complications which may arise. I don't know who this senator is, but Mike has orders not to spare any expense as long as we have the other fellow's money to fight with. Well, if those Iowa lawyers are as good stuff as the Iowa troops were down in Dixie, that's all I ask. Now we'll get our suppers and then sack our saddles. Why, sure, you'll need them. Every good cowman takes his saddle wherever he goes, though he may not have clothes enough with him to dust a fiddle." End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Outlet by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In Quarantine. We reached Miles City shortly after midnight. It was the recognized cattle center of Montana at that time, but devoid of the highlights which were a feature of the trail towns. The village boasted the usual number of saloons and dance houses, and likewise an ordinance compelling such resorts to close on the stroke of 12. Lovell had been there before and led the way to a well-known hostelry. The house was crowded, and the best the night clerk could do was to give us a room with 2 beds. This was perfectly satisfactory, as it was a large apartment and fronted out on an open gallery. Old man Don suggested we take the mattresses outside, but as this was my first chance to sleep in a bed since leaving the ranch in March, I wanted all the comforts that were due me. Sponsilier likewise favored the idea of sleeping inside, and our employer yielded, taking the single bed on retiring. The night was warm, and after thrashing about for nearly an hour, supposing that Dave and I were asleep, Old man Don arose and quietly dragged his mattress outside. Our bed was soft and downy, but in spite of the lateness of the hour, and having been in our saddles at dawn, we tossed about, unable to sleep. After agreeing that it was the mattress, we took the covering and pillows and lay down on the floor, falling into a deep slumber almost instantly. "Well, wouldn't that jar your eccentric?" said Dave to me the next morning, speaking of our inability to sleep in a bed. "I slept in one in Ogallala, and I wasn't over full either." Lovell remained with us all the next day. He was well known in Miles City, having in other years sold cattle to resident cowmen. The day was spent in hunting up former acquaintances, getting the lay of the land, and feeling the public pulse on the matter of quarantine on Southern cattle. The outlook was to our liking, as heavy losses had been sustained from fever the year before, and steps had already been taken to isolate all through animals until frost fell. Report was abroad that there were already within the jurisdiction of Montana over 150,000 through Texas cattle, with the possibility of one-third that number more being added before the close of the season. The territory had established a quarantine camp on the Wyoming line, forcing all Texas stock to follow down the eastern side of the Powder River. Fully 100 miles on the north, a deadline was drawn from Powderville on that watercourse eastward to a spur of the Powder River Mountains, thus setting aside a quarantine ground ample to accommodate 500,000 cattle. Local range riders kept all the native and wintered Texas cattle to the westward of the river and away from the through ones, which was easily done by riding lines, the southern herds being held under constant control and hence never straying. The first Texas herds to arrive naturally traveled north to the deadline, and choosing a range, went into camp until frost relieved them. It was an unwritten law that a herd was entitled to as much grazing land as it needed, and there was a report about Miles City that the quarantine ground was congested with cattle halfway from Powderville to the Wyoming line. The outlook was encouraging. Quarantine was working a hardship to herds along the old Powder River route, yet their enforced isolation was like a tempered wind to our cause and cattle, the latter then leisurely grazing across Dakota from the Little Missouri to the mouth of the Yellowstone. Fortune favored us in many respects. About Miles City there was no concealment of our mission, resulting in an old acquaintance of Lovell's loaning us horses, while old man Don had no trouble in getting drafts cashed to the amount of $2,000. What he expected to do with this amount of money was a mystery to Dave and myself, a mystery which instantly cleared when we were in the privacy of our room at the hotel. "Here, boys," said old man Don, throwing the roll of money on the bed. "Divide this wad between you. There might be such a thing as using a little here and there to sweeten matters up, and making yourselves rattling good fellows wherever you go. Now, in the first place, I want you both to understand that this money is clear velvet, and don't hesitate to spend it freely. Eat and drink all you can, and gamble a little of it if that is necessary. You two will saddle up in the morning and ride to Powderville, while I lie around here a few days and try the market for cattle next year, and then go on to the Big Horn on my way to the Crow Agency. Feel your way carefully, locate the herds of Field, Ratcliffe and Company, and throw everything in their way to retard progress. It is impossible to foretell what may happen, and for that reason only general orders can be given. And remember, I don't want to see that money again if there is any chance to use it." Powderville was a long day's ride from Miles City. By making an early start and resting a few hours at noon, we reached that straggling outpost shortly after nightfall. There was a roadhouse for the wayfaring man and a corral for his beast, a general store, opposition saloons, and the regulation blacksmith shop, constituting the business interest of Powderville. As arriving guests, a rough but cordial welcome was extended us by the keeper of the hostelry, and we mingled with the other travelers, but never once mentioning our business. I was uneasy over the money in our possession, not that I feared robbery, but my mind constantly reverted to it, and it was with difficulty that I refrained from continually feeling to see that it was safe. Sponsilier had concealed his in his boot, and as we rode along, contended that he could feel the roll chafing his ankle. I had tied 2 handkerchiefs together, and rolling my share in one of them, belted the amount between my overshirt and undershirt. The belt was not noticeable, but in making the ride that day, my hand involuntarily went to my side where the money lay, the action never escaping the notice of Sponsilier, who constantly twitted me over my nervousness. And although we were tired as dogs after our long ride, I awoke many times at night and felt to see if my money was safe. My partner slept like a log. Several cowmen ranching on the lower Powder River had headquarters at this outpost. The next morning Sponsilier and I made their acquaintance, and during the course of the day got a clear outline of the situation. On the west the river was the recognized deadline to the Wyoming boundary, while 2 camps of 5 men each patrolled the dividing line on the north, drifting back the native stock and holding the through herds in quarantine. The nearest camp was some distance east of Powderville, and saddling up towards evening, we rode out and spent the night at the first quarantine station. A wagon and 2 tents, a relay of saddle horses, and an arsenal of long-range firearms composed the outfit. 3 of the 5 men on duty were Texans. Making ourselves perfectly at home, we had no trouble in locating the herds in question, they having already sounded the tocsin to clear the way, claiming government beef recognized no local quarantine. The herds were not over 30 miles to the south, and expectation ran high as to the results when an attempt should be made to cross the deadline. Trouble had already occurred where outfits respecting the quarantine were trespassed upon by 3 herds, making claim of being under government protection and entitled to the rights of eminent domain. Fortunately, several of the herds on the immediate line had been bought at Ogallala and were in possession of ranch outfits who owned ranges farther north and were anxious to see quarantine enforced. These local cowmen would support the established authority, and trouble was expected. Sponsilier and I widened the breach by denouncing these intruders as the hirelings of a set of ringsters who had no regard for the rights of anyone, and volunteered our services in enforcing quarantine against them the same as others. Our services were gratefully accepted. The next morning we were furnished fresh horses, and one of us was requested, as we were strangers, to ride down the country and reconnoiter the advance of the defiant drovers. As I was fearful that Field or Ratcliffe might be accompanying the herds and recognize me, Sponsilier went instead, returning late that evening. "Well, fellows," said Dave, as he dismounted at the quarantine camp, "I've seen the herds, and they propose to cross this deadline of yours as easily as water goes through a gourd funnel. They'll be here by noon tomorrow, and they've got the big conversation right on tap to show that the government couldn't feed its army if it wasn't for a few big cowmen like them. There's a strange corporal over the 3 herds, and they're working on 5 horses to the man. But the major domo's the whole works. He's a windy cuss, and intimates that he has a card or 2 up his sleeve that will put these quarantine guards to sleep when he springs them. He's a new man to me. At least he wasn't with the gang at Ogallala." During the absence of my partner, I had ridden the deadline on the north. A strip of country 5 miles wide was clear of cattle above the boundary, while below were massed 4 herds, claiming the range from the mountains to the Powder River. The leader of the quarantine guards, Fred Ulmer, had accompanied me on the ride, and on our return we visited 3 of the outfits, urging them to hold all the reserve forces subject to call, in case an attempt was made to force the deadline. At each camp I took every possible chance to sow the seeds of dissension and hatred against the high-handed methods of the Western Supply Company. Defining our situation clearly, I asked each foreman, in case these herds defied local authority, who would indemnify the owners for the loss among native cattle by fever between Powderville and the mouth of the Yellowstone? Would the drovers? Would the government? Leaving these and similar thoughts for their consideration, Ulmer and I had arrived at the first quarantine station shortly before the return of my partner. Upon the report of Sponsilier, Ulmer was appointed captain, and lost no time in taking action. After dark, a scout was sent to Camp No. 2, a meeting place was appointed on Wolf Creek below, and orders were given to bring along every possible man from the local outfits and to meet at the rendezvous within an hour after sunup the next morning. Ulmer changed horses and left for Powderville, assuring us that he would rally every man interested in quarantine and have his posse below on the creek by sunrise. The remainder of us at headquarters were under orders to bring all the arms and ammunition and join the quarantine forces at the meeting place some 5 miles from our camp. We were also to touch at and command the presence of one of the 4 outfits while en route. I liked the determined action of Captain Ulmer, who I learned had immigrated with his parents to Montana when a boy, and had grown into manhood on the frontier. Sponsilier was likewise pleased with the quarantine leader, and we lay awake far into the night reviewing the situation and trying to anticipate any possible contingency that might thwart our plans. But to our best reasoning, the horizon was clear, and if Field, Ratcliffe and Company's cattle reached Fort Buford on the day of delivery, well, it would be a miracle. Fresh horses were secured at dawn, and breakfast would be secured en route with the cow outfit. There were a dozen large caliber rifles in scabbards, and burdening ourselves with 2 heavy guns to the man and an abundance of ammunition, we abandoned Quarantine Station No. 1 for the time being. The camp which we were to touch at was the one nearest the river and north of Wolf Creek, and we galloped up to it before the sun had even risen. Since everything was coming our way, Sponsilier and I observed a strict neutrality, but a tow-headed Texan rallied the outfit, saying, "Make haste, fellows, and saddle up your horses. Those 3 herds which raised such a rumpus up on the Little Powder have sent down word that they're going to cross our deadline today if they have to prize up hell and put a chunk under it. We have decided to call their bluff before they even reach the line and make them show their hand for all this big talk. Here's half a dozen guns and cartridges galore, but hustle yourselves. Fred went into Powderville last night and will meet us above at the Twin Buttes this morning with every cowman in town. All the other outfits have been sent for, and we have enough men to make our bluff stand up, never fear. From what I learn, these herds belong to a lot of Yankee speculators, and they don't give a tinker's damn if all the cattle in Montana die from fever. They're no better than anybody else, and if we allow them to go through, they'll leave a trail of dead natives that will stink us out of this valley. Make haste, everybody." I could see at a glance that the young Texan had touched their pride. The foreman detailed 3 men to look after the herd, and the balance made hasty preparations to accompany the quarantine guards. A relief was rushed away for the herders, and when the latter came in, they reported having sighted the posse from Powderville, heading across country for the Twin Buttes. Meanwhile, a breakfast had been bolted by the guards, Sponsilier and myself, and swinging into our saddle, we rounded a bluff bend of the creek and rode for the rendezvous, some 3 miles distant. I noticed by the brands that nearly every horse in that country had been born in Texas, and the short time in which we covered the intervening miles proved that the change of climate had added to their stability and bottom. Our first glimpse of the meeting point revealed the summit of the buttes fairly covered with horsemen. From their numbers it was evident that ours was the last contingent to arrive, but before we reached the twin mounds the posse rode down from the lookout and a courier met and turned us from our course. The lead herd had been sighted in trail formation but a few miles distant, heading north, and it was the intention to head them at the earliest moment. The messenger inquired of our numbers and reported those arrived at 45, making the posse, when united, a few over 60 men. A juncture of forces was effected within a mile of the lead herd. It was a unique posse. Old frontiersmen with patriarchal beards and sawed-off shotguns chewed their tobacco complacently as they rode forward at a swinging gallop. Beardless youths, armed with the old buffalo guns of their fathers, led the way as if an Indian invasion had called them forth. Soldiers of fortune with Southern accents who were assisting in the conquest of a new empire intermingled with the hurrying throng, and two men whose home was in Medina County, Texas, looked on and approved. The very horses had caught the inspiration of the moment, champing bits in their effort to forge to the front rank, while the blood-stained slaver coated many breasts or dribbled from our boots. Before we met the herd, a halt was called, and about a dozen men were deployed off on each flank, while the main body awaited the arrival of the cattle. The latter were checked by the pointmen and turned back when within a few hundred yards of the main posse. Several horsemen from the herd rode forward, and one politely inquired the meaning of this demonstration. The question was met by a counter one from Captain Ulmer, who demanded to know the reason why these cattle should trespass on the rights of others and ignore local quarantine. The spokesman in behalf of the herd turned in his saddle and gave an order to send some certain person forward. Sponsilier whispered to me that this fellow was merely a segundo. "But wait till the major domo arrives," he added. The appearance of the posse and the halting of the herd summoned that personage from the rear to the front, and the next moment he was seen galloping up the column of cattle. With a plausible smile, this high mogul, on his arrival, repeated the previous question, and on a similar demand from the captain of the posse, he broke into a jolly laugh from which he recovered with difficulty. "Why, gentlemen," he said, every word dripping with honeyed sweetness, "this is entirely uncalled for. I assure you that it was purely an oversight on my part that I did not send you word in advance that these herds of mine are government cattle and not subject to local quarantine. My associates are the largest army contractors in the country. These cattle are due at Fort Buford on the 15th of this month, and any interference on your part would be looked upon as an insult to the government. In fact, the post commander at Fort Laramie insisted that he be permitted to send a company of cavalry to escort us across Wyoming, and assured us that a troop from Fort Keogh, if requested, would meet our cattle on the Montana line. The Army is jealous over its supplies, but I declined all military protection, knowing that I had but to show my credentials to pass unmolested anywhere. Now, if you care to look over these papers, you will see that these cattle are en route to Fort Buford on an assignment of the original contract issued by the Secretary of War to the Western Supply Company. Very sorry to put you to all this trouble, but these herds must not be interfered with. I trust that you gentlemen understand the government is supreme." As the papers mentioned were produced, Sponsilier kicked me on the shin, gave me a quiet wink, and nodded towards the documents then being tendered to Captain Ulmer. Groping at his idea, I rode forward, and as the papers were being returned with a mere glance on the part of the quarantine leader, I politely asked if I might see the assignment of the original contract. But a quizzical smile met my request, and shaking out the heavy parchment, he rapped it with his knuckles of his disengaged hand, remarking as he returned it to his pocket, "Sorry, but altogether too valuable to allow out of my possession. Just what I would have done with the beribboned document, except to hand it over to Sponsilier, is beyond me. Yet I was vaguely conscious that its destruction was of importance to our side of the matter at issue. At the same instant in which my request was declined, the big medicine man turned to Captain Ulmer and suavely remarked, "You found everything as represented, did you?" "Why, I heard your statement, and I have also heard it disputed from other sources. In fact, I have nothing to do with you except to enforce the quarantine now established by the cattlemen of eastern Montana. If you have any papers showing that your herds were wintered north of latitude 37, you can pass, as this quarantine is only enforced against cattle from south of that degree. This territory lost $500,000 worth of native stock last fall from Texas fever, and this season they propose to apply the ounce of preventive. You will have ample time to reach your destination after frost falls, and your detention by quarantine will be a good excuse for your delay. Now, unless you can convince me that your herds are immune, I'll show you a good place to camp on the head of Wolf Creek. It will probably be a matter of 10 to 15 days before the quarantine is lifted, and we are enforcing it against citizens of Montana and Texas alike, and no exception can be made in your case." "But, my dear sir, this is not a local or personal matter. Whatever you do, don't invite the frown of the government. Let me warn you not to act in haste. Now, remember—" "You made your cracks that you would cross this quarantine line," interrupted Ulmer bristlingly, "and I want you to find out your mistake. There's no occasion for further words, and you can either order your outfit to turn your cattle east, or I'll send men to do it myself." The major domo turned and galloped back to his men, a number of whom had congregated near at hand. The next moment he returned and haughtily threatened to surrender the cattle then and there unless he was allowed to proceed. "Give him a receipt for his beeves, Fred," quietly remarked an old cowman, gently stroking his beard, "and I'll take these boys over here on the right and start the cattle. That will be the safest way, unless the gentleman can indemnify us. I lost $10,000 worth of stock last fall, and as a citizen of Montana I have objections to leaving a trail of fever from here to the mouth of the Yellowstone. And tell him he can have a bond for his cattle," called back the old man as he rode out of hearing. The lead herd was pointed to the east, and squads of men rode down and met the other two, veering them off on an angle to the right. Meanwhile the superintendent raved, pleaded, and threatened without avail, but finally yielded and refused the receipt and dispossession of his cattle. This was just what the quarantine captain wanted, and the dove of peace began to shake its plumage. Within an hour all three of the herds were moving out for the head of Wolf Creek, accompanied only by the quarantine guards, the remainder of the posse returning to their homes or their work. Having ample time on our hands, Sponsilier and I expected to remain at Station No. 1 until after the 10th of September, and accordingly made ourselves at home at that camp. To say that we were elated over the situation puts it mildly, and that night the two of us lost nearly $100 playing poker with the quarantine guards. A strict vigilance was maintained over the herds in question, but all reports were unanimous that they were contentedly occupying their allotted range. But at noon on the third day of the enforced isolation, a messenger from Powderville arrived at the first station. A troop of cavalry from Fort Keogh, accompanied by a pack train, had crossed the Powder River below the hamlet, their avowed mission being to afford an escort for certain government beef, then under detention by the local authorities. The report fell among us like a flash of lightning. Ample time had elapsed for a messenger to ride to the Yellowstone, and returning with troops, pilot them to the camps of Field, Ratcliffe and Company. A consultation was immediately held, but no definite line of action had been arrived at when a horseman from one of the lower camps dashed up and informed us that the three herds were already trailing out of the deadline. under an escort of cavalry. Saddling up, we rallied what few men were available, determined to make a protest, at least, in the interest of humanity to dumb brutes. We dispatched couriers to the nearest camps and the outer quarantine station, but before a posse of 20 men arrived, the lead herd was within a mile of the deadline, and we rode out and met them. Fully 80 troopers, half of which rode in column formation in front, halted us as we approached. Terse and to the point were the questions and answers exchanged between the military arm of the government and the quarantine authorities of Montana. When the question arose of indemnity to citizens in case of death to native cattle, a humane chord was touched in the young lieutenant in command, resulting in his asking several questions to which the major domo protested. Once satisfied of the justice of the quarantine, the officer in defense of his action said, "Gentlemen, I am under instructions to give these herds, intended for use at Fort Buford, a 3-day escort beyond this quarantine line. I am very much obliged to you all for making so clear the necessity of isolating herds of Texas cattle, and that little or no hardship may attend my orders. You may have until noon tomorrow to drift all native stock west of the Powder River. When these herds encamp for the night, they will receive instructions not to move forward before 12 tomorrow. I find the situation quite different from reports. Nevertheless, orders are orders." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Outlet by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. On the Just and the Unjust. The quarantine guards returned to their camp. Our plans were suddenly and completely upset, and not knowing which way to turn, Sponsilier and I, slightly crestfallen, accompanied the guards. It was already late in the evening, but Captain Ulmer took advantage of the brief respite granted him to clear the east half of the valley of native cattle. Couriers were dispatched to sound the warning among the ranches down the river, while a regular roundup outfit was mustered among the camps to begin the drifting of range stock that evening. A few men were left at the 2 camps, as quarantine was not to be abandoned, and securing our borrowed horses, my partner and I bade our friends farewell and set out on our return for the Yellowstone. Merely touching at Powderville for a hasty supper, we held a northwest cross-country course far into the night, when we unsaddled to rest our horses and catch a few hours' sleep. But sunrise found us again in our saddles, and by the middle of the forenoon we were breakfasting with our friends in Miles City. Fort Keogh was but a short distance up the river. The military interference had been secured through fraud and deception. There was not the shadow of doubt. During the few hours which we spent in Miles, the cattle interests were duly aroused, and a committee of cowmen were appointed to call on the post commander at Keogh with a formidable protest, which would no doubt be supplemented later on the return of the young lieutenant and his troopers. During our ride the night before, Sponsilier and I had discussed the possibility of arousing the authorities at Glendive, since it was in the neighborhood of 100 miles from Powderville to the former point on the railroad. The herds would consume nearly a week in reaching there. A freight train was caught that afternoon, and within 24 hours after leaving the quarantine camp on the Powder River, we had opened headquarters at the Stock Exchange Saloon in Glendive. On arriving, I deposited $100 with the proprietor of that bar room, with the understanding that it was to be used in getting an expression from the public in regard to the question of Texas fever. Before noon the next day, Dave Sponsilier and Tom Quirk were not only the 2 most popular men in Glendive, but quarantine had been decided on with ringing resolutions. Our standing was soon of the best. Horses were tendered us, and saddling one, I crossed the Yellowstone and started down the river to arouse outlying ranches, while Sponsilier and a number of local cowmen rode south to locate a camp and a deadline. I was absent 2 days, having gone north as far as Wolf Island, where I recrossed the river, returning on the eastern side of the valley. At no ranch which was visited did my mission fail of meeting hearty approval, especially on the western side of the river, where severe losses from fever had been sustained the fall before. One ranch on 13 Mile offered, if necessary, to send every man in its employ, with their own wagon and outfit of horses, free of all charge, until quarantine was lifted. But I suggested, instead, that they send 3 or 4 men with their horses and blankets, leaving the remainder to be provided for by the local committee. In my 2 days' ride, over 50 volunteers were tendered, but I refused all except 20, who were to report at Glendive no later than the morning of the 6th. On my return to the railroad, all arrangements were completed and the outlook was promising. Couriers had arrived from the south during my absence, bringing the news of the coming of the through Texas cattle and warning the local ranchers to clear the way or take the consequences. All native stock had been pushed west of the Powder and Yellowstone, as far north as Cabin Creek, which had been decided on as the second quarantine line. Daily reports were being received of the whereabouts of the moving herds, and at the rate they were traveling, they would reach Cabin Creek about the 7th. 2 wagons had been outfitted, cooks employed, and couriers dispatched to watch the daily progress of the cattle, which, if following the usual route, would strike the deadline some distance south of Glendive. During the next few days, Sponsilier and I were social lions in that town, and so great was our popularity we could have either married or been elected to office. We limited our losses at poker to so much an evening, and what we won from the merchant class we invariably lost among the volunteer guards and cowmen, taking our luck with the Savoie, which proved us dead game sports, and made us hosts of friends. We had contributed $100 to the general quarantine fund, and had otherwise made ourselves popular with all classes in the brief time at our command. Under the pretense that we might receive orders at any time to overtake our herds, we declined all leadership in the second campaign about to be inaugurated against Texas fever. Dave and I were both feeling rather chesty over the masterful manner in which we had aroused the popular feeling in favor of quarantine in our own interest, and at the same time making it purely a local movement. We were swaggering around like ward heelers when on the afternoon of the 5th the unexpected again happened. The business interests of the village usually turned out to meet the daily passenger trains, even the poker games taking a recess until the cars went past. The arrival and departure of citizens of the place were noted by everyone, and strangers were looked upon with timidity, very much as in all simple communities. Not taking any interest in the passing trains, Sponsilier was writing a letter to his girl in Texas, while I was shaking dice for the cigars with the bartender of the stock exchange, when the eastbound arrived. After the departure of the train, I did not take any notice of the return of the boys to the abandoned games, or the influx of patrons to the house, until someone laid a hand on my shoulder and quietly said, "Isn't your name Quirk?" Turning to the speaker, I was confronted by Mr. Field and Mr. Ratcliffe, who had just arrived by train from the west. Admitting my identity, I invited them to have a cigar or liquid refreshment, inquiring whence they had come and where their cattle were. To my surprise, Fort Keogh was named as their last refuge, and the herds were reported to cross the railroad within the next few days. Similar questions were asked me, but before replying I caught Sponsilier's eye and summoned him with a wink. On Dave's presenting himself, I innocently asked the pair if they did not remember my friend as one of the men whom they had under arrest at Dodge. They grunted an embarrassed acknowledgment, which was returned in the same coin, when I proceeded to inform them that our cattle crossed the railroad at Little Missouri 10 days before, and that we were only waiting the return of Mr. Lovell from the Crow Agency before proceeding to our destination. With true Yankee inquisitiveness, other questions followed, the trend of which was to get us to admit that we had something to do with the present activities in quarantining Texas cattle. But I avoided their leading queries and looked appealingly at Sponsilier, who came to my rescue with an answer born of the moment. "Well, gentlemen," said Dave, seating himself on the bar and leisurely rolling a cigarette, "that town of Little Missouri is about the dullest hole that I was ever water-bound in. Honestly, I'd rather be with the cattle than loafing in it with money in my pocket. Now, this town has got some get-up about it. I'd kiss a man's foot if he complains that this burg isn't sporty enough for his blood. They've given me a run here for my white alley, and I still think I know something about that game called draw poker. But you were speaking about quarantine. Yes, there seems to have been a good many cattle lost through these parts last fall. You ought to have sent your herds up through the Dakota, where there is no native stock to interfere. I'd hate to have cattle coming down the Powder River. A friend of mine passed through here yesterday. His herd was sold for delivery on the Elkhorn north of here, and he tells me he may not be able to reach there before October. He saw your herds and tells me you are driving the guts out of them. So if there's anything in that old ship fever theory, you ought to be quarantined until it snows. There's a right smart talk around here of fixing a deadline below somewhere, and if you get tied up before reaching the railroad, it won't surprise me a bit. When it comes to handling the cattle, old man Don has the good hard cow sense every time, but you shorthorns give me a pain." "What did I tell you?" said Radcliffe, the elder one, to his partner, as they turned to leave. On nearing the door, Mr. Field halted and begrudgingly said, "See you later, Quirk." "Not if I see you first," I replied. "You ain't my kind of cowman." Not even waiting for them to pass outside, Sponsilier, from his elevated position, called everyone to the bar to irrigate. The boys quit their games as they lined up in a double row. Dave begged the bartender to bestir themselves and said to his guests, "Those are the kid-gloved cowmen that I've been telling you about, the owners of the Texas cattle that are coming through here. Did I hang it on them artistically, or shall I call them back and smear it on a shade deeper? They smelt a mouse all right, and when their cattle reach Cabin Creek, they'll smell the rat in earnest. Now, set out the little and big bottle, and everybody have a cigar on the side. And drink hearty, lads, for tomorrow we may be drinking branch water in a quarantine camp." The arrival of Field and Radcliffe was accepted as a defiance to the local cattle interests. Popular feeling was intensified when it was learned that they were determined not to recognize any local quarantine, and were secretly inquiring for extra men to guard their herd in passing Glendive. There was always a rabble element in every frontier town, and no doubt, as strangers, they could secure assistance in quarters that the local cowmen would spurn. Matters were approaching a white heat, when, late that night, an expected courier arrived and reported the cattle coming through at the rate of 20 miles a day. They were not following any particular trail, traveling almost due north, and if the present rate of travel was maintained, Cabin Creek would be reached during the forenoon of the 7th. This meant business, and the word was quietly passed around that all volunteers were to be ready to move in the morning. A cowman named Redillac, owner of a range on the Yellowstone, had previously been decided on as captain, and would have under him not less than 75 chosen men, which number, if necessary, could easily be increased to 100. Morning dawned on a scene of active operations. Two wagons were started fully an hour in advance of the cavalcade, which was to follow, driving a remuda of over 200 saddle horses. Sponsilier and I expected to accompany the outfit, but at the last moment our plans were changed by an incident and we remained behind, promising to overtake them later. There were a number of old buffalo hunters in town, living a precarious life, and one of their number had quietly informed Sheriff Wherry that they had been approached with an offer of $5 a day to act as an escort to the herds while passing through. The quarantine captain looked upon that element as a valuable ally, suggesting that if it was a question of money, our side ought to be in the market for their services. Heartily agreeing with him, the company of guards started, leaving their captain behind with Sponsilier and myself. Glendive was a county seat, and with the assistance of the sheriff, we soon had every buffalo hunter in the town corralled. They were a fine lot of rough men, inclined to be convivial, and with the assistance of Sheriff Wherry, coupled with the high standing of the quarantine captain, on a soldier's introduction, Dave and I made a good impression among them. Sponsilier did the treating and talking, his offer being $10 a day for a man and horse, which was promptly accepted when the question naturally arose who would stand sponsor for the wages. Dave backed off some distance, and standing on his left foot, pulled off his right boot, shaking out a roll of money on the floor. "There's the long green, boys," said he, "and you fellows can name your own banker. I'll make it up 1,000, and whoever you say goes with me. Shall it be the sheriff, or Mr. Redillac, or the proprietor of the stock exchange?" Sheriff Wherry interfered, relieving the embarrassment in appointing a receiver, and vouched that these two Texans were good for any reasonable sum. The buffalo hunters approved, apologizing to Sponsilier as he pulled on his boot for questioning his financial standing and swearing allegiance in every breath. An hour's time was granted in which to saddle and make ready, during which we had a long chat with Sheriff Wherry and found him a valuable ally. He had cattle interests in the country, and when the hunters appeared 15 strong, he mounted his horse and accompanied us several miles on the way. "Now, boys," said he at parting, "I'll keep an eye over things around town, and if anything important happens, I'll send a courier with the news. If those shorthorns attempt to offer any opposition, I'll run a blazer on them, and if necessary, I'll jug the pair. You fellas just buffalo the herds, and the sheriff's office will keep cases on any happenings around Glendive. It's understood that night or day your camp can be found on Cabin Creek, opposite the old eagle tree. Better send me word as soon as the herds arrive. Good luck to you, lads." Neither wagons nor guards were even sighted during our 3 hours' ride to the appointed campground. On our arrival, tents were being pitched and men were dragging up wood, while the cooks were busily preparing a late dinner, the station being fully 15 miles south of the railroad. Scouts were thrown out during the afternoon, corrals built, and evening found the quarantine camp well established for the comfort of its 90-odd men. The buffalo hunters were given special attention and christened the Sponsilier Guards. They took again to outdoor life as in the old days. The report of the scouts was satisfactory. All 3 of the herds had been seen and would arrive on scheduled time. A hush of expectancy greeted this news, but Sponsilier and I ridiculed the idea that there would be any opposition, except a big talk and plenty of bluffing. "Well, if that's what they rely on," said Captain Redillac, "then they're as good as in quarantine this minute. If you feel certain they can't get help from Fort Keogh a second time, those herds will be our guests until further orders. What we want to do now is spike every possible chance for their getting any help, and the matter will pass over like a summer picnic. If you boys think there's any danger of an appeal to Fort Buford, the military authorities want to be notified that the Yellowstone Valley has quarantined against Texas fever and asks their cooperation in enforcing the same." "I can fix that," replied Sponsilier. "We have lawyers at Buford right now, and I can wire them the situation fully in the morning. If they rely on the military, they will naturally appeal to the nearest post, and if Keogh and Buford turn them down, the next ones are on the Missouri River, and at that distance cavalry couldn't reach here within 10 days. Oh, I think we've got a grapevine twist on 'em this time." Sponsilier sat up half the night wording a message to our attorneys at Fort Buford. The next morning found me bright and early on the road to Glendive with a dispatch, the sending of which would deplete my cash on hand by several dollars. But what did we care for expense when we had the money and orders to spend it? I regretted my absence from the quarantine camp, as I was anxious to be present on the arrival of the herds, and again watch the major domo run on the rope and fume and charge in vain. But the importance of blocking assistance was so urgent that I would gladly have ridden to Buford if necessary. In that bracing atmosphere, it was a fine morning for the ride, and I was rapidly crossing the country when a vehicle in the dip of the plain was sighted several miles ahead. I was following no road, but when the driver of the conveyance saw me, he turned across my front and signaled. On meeting the rig, I could hardly control myself from laughing outright, for there on the rear seat sat Field and Ratcliffe, extremely gruff and uncongenial. Common courtesies were exchanged between the driver and myself, and I was able to answer clearly his leading questions. Yes, the herds would reach Cabin Creek before noon. The old eagle tree, which could be seen from the first swell of the plain beyond, marked the quarantine camp, and it was the intention to isolate the herds on the South Fork of Cabin. "Drive on," said a voice, and in the absence of any gratitude expressed, I inwardly smiled in reward. I was detained in Glendive until late in the day, waiting for an acknowledgment of the message. Sheriff Weary informed me that the only move attempted on the part of the Shorthorn drovers was the arrest of Sponsilier and myself on the charge of being accomplices in the shooting of one of their men on the North Platte. But the sheriff had assured the gentlemen that our detention would have no effect on quarantining their cattle, and the matter was taken under advisement and dropped. It was late when I started for camp that evening. The drovers had returned accompanied by their superintendent, and were occupying the depot, burning the wires in every direction. I was risking no chances, and cultivated the company of Sheriff Weary until the acknowledgment arrived, when he urged me to ride one of his horses in returning to the camp, and insisted on my taking a carbine. Possibly this was fortunate, for before I had ridden 1/3 of the distance to the quarantine camp, I met a cavalcade of nearly a dozen men from the isolated herds. When they halted and inquired the distance to Glendive, one of their number recognized me as having been among the quarantine guards at Powderville. I admitted that I was there, turning my horse so that the carbine fell to my hand, and politely asked if anyone had any objections. It seems that no one had, and after a few commonplace inquiries were exchanged, we passed on our way. There was great rejoicing on Cabin Creek that night. Songs were sung, and white navy beans passed current in numerous poker games until the small hours of the morning. There had been nothing dramatic in the meeting between the herds and the quarantine guards, the latter force having been augmented by visiting ranchmen and their help, until protest would have been useless. A routine of work had been outlined, much stricter than at Powderville, and a surveillance of the camps was constantly maintained. Not that there was any danger of escape, but to see that the herds occupied the country allotted to them, and did not pollute any more territory than was necessary. The Sponsilier guards were given an easy day shift, and held a circle of admirers at night recounting and living over again the good old days. Visitors from either side of the Yellowstone were early callers, and during the afternoon the sheriff from Glendive arrived. I did not know until then that Mr. Wherry was a candidate for re-election that fall, but the manner in which he mixed with the boys was enough to warrant his election for life. What endeared him to Sponsilier and myself was the fund of information he had collected, and the close tab he had kept on every movement of the opposition drovers. He told us that their appeal to Fort Keogh for assistance had been refused with a stinging rebuke, that a courier had started the evening before down the river for Fort Buford, and that Mr. Ratcliffe had personally gone to Fort Abraham Lincoln to solicit help. The latter post was fully 150 miles away, but that distance could be easily covered by a special train in case of government interference. It rained on the afternoon of the 9th. The courier had returned from Fort Buford on the north, unsuccessful, as had also Mr. Ratcliffe from Fort Lincoln on the Missouri River to the eastward. The latter post had referred the request to Keogh and washed its hands of intermeddling in a country not tributary to its territory. The last hope of interference was gone, and the rigors of quarantine closed in like a siege, with every gun of the enemy spiked. Let it be a week or a month before the quarantine was lifted, the citizens of Montana had so willed it, and their wish was law. Evening fell, and the men drew round the fire. The guards buttoned their coats as they rode away, and the tired ones drew their blankets around them as they lay down to sleep. Scarcely a star could be seen in the sky overhead, but before my partner or myself sought our bed, a great calm had fallen. The stars were shining, and the night had grown chilly. The old buffalo hunters predicted a change in the weather, but beyond that they were reticent. As Sponsilier and I lay down to sleep, we agreed that if 3 days, even 2 days, were spared us, those cattle in quarantine could never be tendered at Fort Buford on the appointed day of delivery. But during the early hours of the morning we were aroused by the returning guards, one of whom halted his horse near our blankets and shouted, "Hey there, you Texans! Get up! A frost has fallen!" Sure enough, it had frosted during the night, and the quarantine was lifted. When day broke, every twig and blade of grass glistened in silver sheen, and the horses on picket stood humped and shivering. The sun arose upon the herds moving, with no excuse to say them nay, and orders were issued to the guards to break camp and disperse to their homes. As we rode into Glendive that morning, sullen and defeated by a power beyond our control, in speaking of the peculiarity of the intervention, Sponsilier said, "Well, if it rains on the just and the unjust alike, why shouldn't it frost the same?" End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Outlet by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Fort Buford. We were at our rope's end. There were few accounts to settle in Glendive, and after which we would shake its dust from our feet. Very few of the quarantine guards returned to town, and with the exception of Sheriff Wherry, none of the leading cowmen, all having ridden direct for their ranches. Long before the train arrived, which would carry us to Little Missouri, the opposition herds appeared and crossed the railroad west of town. Their commissaries entered the village for supplies, while the major domo, surrounded by a bodyguard of men, rode about on his miserable palfrey. The sheriff, fearing a clash between the victorious and the vanquished, kept an eye on Sponsilier and me as we walked the streets, freely expressing our contempt of Field, Ratcliffe and Company, their henchmen, and their methods. Dave and I were both nerved to desperation. Sheriff Wherry, anxious to prevent a conflict, counseled with the opposition drovers, resulting in their outfits leaving town, while the principals
took stage across to Buford. Meanwhile, Sponsilier had wired full particulars to our employer at Bighorn. It was hardly necessary, as the frost, no doubt, was general all over Montana, but we were anxious to get into communication with Lovell immediately on his return to the railroad. We had written him from Miles of our failure at Powderville and the expected second stand at Glendive, and now the elements had notified him that the opposition herds were within striking distance, and would no doubt appear at Buford on or before the day of delivery. An irritable man like our employer would neither eat nor sleep once the delivery at the Crow Agency was over until reaching the railroad, and our message would be awaiting him on his return to Bighorn. Our train reached Little Missouri early in the evening, and leaving word with the agent that we were expecting important messages from the West, we visited the liveryman and inquired about the welfare of our horses. The proprietor of the stable informed us that they had fared well and that he would have them ready for us on an hour's notice. It was after dark, and we were at supper when the first message came. An immediate answer was required, and arising from the table, we left our meal unfinished and hastened to the depot. From then until midnight, messages flashed back and forth, Sponsilier dictating while I wrote. As there was no train before the regular passenger the next day, the last wire requested us to have the horses ready to meet the eastbound, saying that Bob Quirk would accompany Lovell. That night it frosted again. Sponsilier and I slept until noon the next day without awakening. Then the horses were brought in from pasture, and preparations were made to leave that evening. It was in the neighborhood of 90 miles across to the mouth of the Yellowstone, and the chances were that we would ride it without unsaddling. The horses had had a 2 weeks' rest, and if our employer insisted on it, we would breakfast with the herds the next morning. I was anxious to see the cattle again and rejoin my outfit, but like a watched pot, the train was an hour late. Sponsilier and I took advantage of the delay and fortified the inner man against the night and the ride before us. This proved fortunate, as Lovell and my brother had supper en route in the dining car. A running series of questions were asked and answered. Saddles were shaken out of gunny sacks and cinched on waiting horses, as though we were starting to a prairie fire. Bob Quirk's cattle had reached the Crow Agency in splendid condition. The delivery was effected without a word, and old man Don was in possession of a letter from Flood saying that everything had passed smoothly at the Rosebud Agency. Contrary to the expectation of Sponsilier and myself, our employer was in a good humor, fairly walking on the clouds over the success of his first 2 deliveries of the year. But amid the bustle and rush, in view of another frosty night, Sponsilier inquired if it would not be a good idea to fortify against the chill by taking along a bottle of brandy. "Yes, 2 of them, if you want to," said old man Don, in good-humored approval. "Here, Tom, fork this horse and take the pitch out of him," he continued. "I don't like the look of his eye." But before I could reach the horse, one of my own string, Bob Quirk had mounted him, when, in testimony to the nutritive qualities of Dakota's grasses, he arched his spine like a true Texan and outlined a worm fence in bucking a circle. The start was made during the gathering dusk. Sponsilier further lifted the spirits of our employer as we rode along by a clear-cut description of the opposition cattle, declaring that had they ever equaled ours, the handling they had received since leaving Ogallala, compared to his, would class them with short 2s in the spring against long 3s in the fall. Within an hour the stars shone out, and after following the river some 10 miles, we bore directly north until Beaver Creek was reached near midnight. The pace was set at about an 8-mile, steady clip, with an occasional halt to tighten cinches or shift saddles. The horses were capable of a faster gait without tiring, but we were not sure of the route, and were saving them for the finish after daybreak. Early in the night we were conscious that a frost was falling, and several times Sponsilier inquired if no one cared for a nip from his bottle. Bob Quirk started the joke on Dave by declining. Old man Don uncorked the flask and, after smelling the contents, handed it back with his thanks. I caught on to their banter, and not wishing to spoil a good jest, also declined, leaving Sponsilier to drink alone. During the night, whenever conversation lagged, someone was certain to make reference to the remarks which are said to have passed between the governors of the Carolinas, or if that failed to provoke a rise, ask direct if no one had something to ward off the chilly air. After being refused several times, Dave had thrown the bottle away, meeting these jests with the reply that he had a private flask, but its quality was such that he was afraid of offending our cultivated tastes by asking us to join him. Day broke about 5 in the morning. We had been in the saddle nearly 10 hours, and were confident that sunrise would reveal some landmark to identify our location. The atmosphere was frosty and clear, and once the gray of dawn yielded to the rising sun, the outline of the Yellowstone was easily traced on our left, while the bluffs in our front shielded a view of the mother Missouri. In attempting to approach the latter, we encountered some rough country and were compelled to turn towards the former, crossing it at O'Brien's Roadhouse, some 7 miles above the mouth. The husbanded reserves of our horses were shaken out, and shortly afterward smoke clouds from the campfires hanging low attracted our attention. The herds were soon located as they arose and grazed away from their bed grounds. The outfits were encamped on the eastern side of the Yellowstone, and before leaving the government road, we sighted in our front a flag ascending to greet the morning, and the location of Fort Buford was established. Turning towards the cattle, we rode for the lower wagon, and were soon unsaddling at Forrest's camp. The latter had arrived 2 days before and visited the post. He told us that the opposition were there in force, as well as our own attorneys. The arrival of the cattle under contract for that military division was the main topic of discussion, and Forrest had even met a number of civilian employees of Fort Buford whose duties were to look after the government beeves. The foreman of these unenlisted attachés, a Texan named Sanders, had casually ridden past his camp the day before, looking over the cattle, and had pronounced them the finest lot of beeves tendered the government since his connection with that post. "That's good news," said Lovell, as he threw his saddle astride the front wheel of the wagon. "That's the way I like to hear my cattle spoken about. Now you boys want to make friends with all those civilians, and my attorneys and Bob and I will hobnob around with the officers and try and win the good will of the entire post. You want to change your camp every few days and give your cattle good grazing and let them speak for themselves. Better kill a beef among the outfits and insist on all callers staying for meals. We're strangers here, and we want to make a good impression and show the public that we were born white, even if we do handle cattle for a living. Quince, tie up the horses for us, and after breakfast Bob and I will look over the herds and then ride into Fort Buford. Trout for breakfast? You don't mean it." It was true, however, and our appetites did them justice. Forrest reported Splann as having arrived a day late and now encamped the last herd up the valley. Taking our horses with us, Dave and I set out to look up our herds and resume our former positions. I rode through Sponsilier's cattle while en route to my own, and remembered the first impression they had made on my mind, their uniformity in size and smoothness of build, and now found them fattened into finished form, the herd being a credit to any drover. Continuing on my way, I intercepted my own cattle, lying down over hundreds of acres, and so contented that I refused to disturb them. Splann reported not over half a dozen sore-footed ones among them, having grazed the entire distance from Little Missouri, giving the tender cattle a good chance to recover. I had a circle of listeners for several hours in recounting Sponsilier's and my own experiences in the quarantine camps, and our utter final failure except that the opposition herds had been detained, which would force them to drive over 20 miles a day in order to reach Buford on time. On the other hand, an incident of more than ordinary moment had occurred with the cattle some 10 days previous. The slow movement of the grazing herds allowed a great amount of freedom to the boys and was taken advantage of at every opportunity. It seems that on approaching Beaver Creek, Owen Ubery and Runt Pickett had ridden across to it for the purpose of trout fishing. They were gone all day, having struck the creek some 10 or 12 miles west of the cattle, expecting to fish down it and overtake the herds during the evening. But about noon they discovered where a wagon had been burned years before, and nearby were 5 human skeletons, evidently a family. It was possibly the work of Indians or a blizzard, and to prove the discovery, Pickett had brought in one of the skulls and proposed taking it home with him as a memento of the drive. Parent objected to having the reminder in the wagon, and a row resulted between them, till Splann interfered and threw the gruesome relic away. The next morning a dozen of us from the 3 herds rode into the post. Fort Buford was not only a military headquarters, but a supply depot for other posts farther west on the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers. The nearest railroad connection was Glendive, 76 miles up the latter stream. Those steamboats took advantage of the freshets in the river to transport immense supplies from the lower points on the Missouri where there were rail connections. From Buford westward, transportation was effected by boats of lighter draft and the regulation wagon train. It was recognized as one of the most important supply posts in the West. As early as 5 years previous to this date, it had received in a single summer as many as 10,000 beeves. Its provisions for cavalry was one of its boasted features, immense stacks of forage flanking those quarters, while the infantry barracks and officers' quarters were large and comfortable. A sterling little town had sprung up on the outside, affording the citizens employment in wood and hay contracts, and becoming the home of a large number of civilian employees, the post being the mainstay of the village. After settling our quarantine bills, Sponsilier and I each had money left. Our employer refused even to look at our expense bills until after the delivery, but urged us to use freely any remaining funds in cultivating the goodwill of the citizens and soldiery alike. Forrest was accordingly supplied with funds with the understanding that he was to hunt up Sanders and his outfit and show them a good time. The beef foreman was soon located in the quartermaster's office, and having been connected with the post for several years, knew the ropes. He had come to Buford with Texas cattle, and after their delivery had accepted a situation under the acting quartermaster, easily rising to the foremanship through his superior abilities as a cowman. It was like a meeting of long-lost brothers to mingle again with a cow outfit, and the sutler's bar did a flourishing business during our stay in the post. There were 10 men in Sanders' outfit, several of whom besides himself were Texans, and before we parted, every rascal had promised to visit us the next day and look over all the cattle. The next morning, Bob Quirk put in an early appearance at my wagon. He had passed the other outfits and notified us all to have the cattle under convenient herd, properly watered in advance, as the post commandant, quartermaster, and a party of minor officers were going to ride out that afternoon and inspect our beeves. Lovell, of course, would accompany them, and Bob reported him as having made a 10 strike with the officers' mess, not being afraid to spend his money. Fortunately, the present quartermaster at Buford was a former acquaintance of Lovell, the two having had business transactions. The quartermaster had been connected with frontier posts from Fort Clark, Texas, to his present position. According to the report, the opposition were active and waging an aggressive campaign, but not being Western men, were at a disadvantage. Champagne had flowed freely at a dinner given the night before by our employer, during which Senator Aspbrain, in response to a toast, had paid the Army a high tribute for its part it had played in reclaiming the last of our western frontier. The quartermaster, in replying, had felicitously remarked, as a matter of his own observation, that the Californian's love for a horse was only excelled by the Texan's love for a cow, to which, amid uproarious laughter, old man Don arose and bowed his acknowledgment. My brother changed horses and returned to Sponsilier's wagon. Dave had planned to entertain the post-beef outfit for dinner, and had insisted on Bob's presence. They arrived at my herd near the middle of the forenoon, and after showing the cattle and remuda, we all returned to Sponsilier's camp. These civilian employees furnished their own mounts, and were anxious to buy a number of our best horses after the delivery was over. Not even a whisper was breathed about any uncertainty of our filling the outstanding contract, yet Sanders was given to understand that Don Lovell would rather, if he took a fancy to him, give a man a horse than sell him one. Not a word was said about any opposition to our herds. That would come later, and Sanders and his outfit were too good judges of Texas cattle to be misled by any bluster or boastful talk. Sponsilier acted the host, and after dinner unearthed a box of cigars, and we told stories and talked of our homes in the sunny South until the arrival of the military party. The herds had been well watered about noon, and drifted out on the first uplands, and we intercepted the cavalcade before it reached Sponsilier's herd. They were mounted on fine cavalry horses, and the only greeting which passed, aside from a military salute, was when Lovell said, "Dave, show these officers your beeves. Answer any question they may ask to the best of your ability. Gentlemen, excuse me while you look over the cattle." There were about a dozen military men in the party, some of them veterans of the Civil War, others having spent their lifetime on our western frontier, while a few were seeing their first year's service after leaving West Point. In looking over the cattle, the post commander and quartermaster were taken under the wing of Sanders, who, as only a man could who was born to the occupation, called their attention to every fine point about the beeves. After spending fully an hour with Sponsilier's herd, the cavalcade proceeded on to mine, Lovell rejoining the party, but never once attempting to draw out an opinion, and again excusing himself on reaching my cattle. I continued with the military, answering everyone's questions, from the young lieutenants to the veteran commandants, in which I was ably seconded by the quartermaster's foreman. My cattle had a splendid fill on them, and eloquently spoke their own praises, yet Sanders lost no opportunity to enter a clincher in their favor. He pointed out beef after beef, and vouched for the pounds net they would dress, called attention to their sameness in build, ages, and general thrift, until one would have supposed that he was a salesman instead of a civilian employee. My herd was fully 10 miles from the post, and it was necessary for the military to return that evening. Don Lovell and a number of the boys had halted at a distance, and once the inspection was over, we turned and rode back to the waiting group of horsemen. On coming up, a number of the officers dismounted to shift saddles, preparatory to starting on their return, when the quartermaster halted near our employer and said, "Colonel Lovell, let me say to you in all sincerity that in my 25 years' experience on this frontier, I never saw a finer lot of beeves tendered the government than these of yours. My position requires that I should have a fair knowledge of beef cattle, and the prerequisites of my office in a post of Buford's class enable me to employ the best practical men available to perfect the service. I remember the quality of cattle which you delivered 4 years ago to me at Fort Randall, when it was a 6-company post, yet they were not as fine a lot of beeves as these are. I have always contended that there was nothing too good in my department for the men who uphold the colors of our country, especially on the front line. You have been a soldier yourself, and know that I am talking good horse sense, And I want to say to you that whatever the outcome of this dispute may be, if yours are the best cattle, you may count on my support until the drums beat tattoo. The government is liberal and insists on the best. The rank and file are worthy, and yet we don't always get what is ordered and well paid for. Now remember, comrade, if this difference comes to an issue, I'm right behind you. We'll stand or be turned down together." "Thank you, Colonel," replied Mr. Lovell. "It does seem rather fortunate, my meeting up with a former business acquaintance, and at a time when I need him bad. If I am successful in delivering on this Buford award, it will round out, during my 15 years as a drover, over 100,000 cattle that I have sold to the government for its Indian and Army departments. There are no secrets in my business. The reason of my success is simple. My cattle were always there on the appointed day, humanely handled, and generally just a shade better than the specifications. My home country has the cattle for sale. I can tell within 2 bits a head what it will cost to lay them down here, and it's music to my ear to hear you insist on the best. I agree with you that the firing line is entitled to special consideration, yet you know there are ringsters who fatten at the expense of the rank and file. At present I haven't a word to say, but at noon tomorrow I shall tender the post commander at Fort Buford, through his quartermaster, 10,000 beeves, as a subcontractor on the original award to the Western Supply Company." The post commander, an elderly, white-haired officer, rode over and smilingly said, "Now look here, my Texas friend, I'm afraid you are borrowing trouble. True enough, there has been a protest made against our receiving your beeves, and I don't mince my words in saying that some hard things have been said about you. But we happen to know something about your reputation and don't give credit for all that is said. Your beeves are an eloquent argument in your favor, and if I were you I wouldn't worry. It's always a good idea in this western country to make a proviso, and unless the unforeseen happens, the quartermaster's cattle foreman will count your beeves tomorrow afternoon. And for the sake of your company, if we keep you a day or 2 longer settling up, I don't want to hear you kick. Now, come on and go back with us to the post, as I promised my wife to bring you over to our house this evening. She seems to think that a man from Texas with 10,000 cattle ought to have horns, and I want to show her that she's mistaken. Come on now, and not a damned word of protest out of you." The military party started on their return, accompanied by Lovell. The civilian attachés followed at a respectful distance, a number of us joining them as far as Sponsilier's camp. There we halted, when Sanders insisted on an explanation of the remarks which had passed between our employer and his. Being once more among his own, he felt no delicacy in asking for information, which he would never think of doing with his superiors. My brother gave him a true version of the situation, but it remained for Dave Sponsilier to add an outline to the opposition herds and outfits. "With humane treatment," said Dave, "the cattle would have qualified under the specifications. They were bought at Ogallala, and any of the boys here will tell you that the first one was a good herd. The market was all shot to pieces, and they picked them up at their own price, but the owners didn't have cow sense enough to handle the cattle, and put one of their own gang over the herds as superintendent. They left Cabin Creek below Glendive on the morning of the 10th, and they had to travel nearly 20 miles a day to reach here by noon tomorrow. Sanders, you know that gait will soon kill heavy cattle. The outfits were made up of short card men and dance hall ornaments, wild enough to look at, but shy on cattle sabe. Just so they showed up bad and wore 6-shooters, that was enough to win a home with Field and Ratcliffe. If they reach here on time, I'll gamble that there ain't 10 horses in the entire outfit that don't carry a nigger brand. And when it comes to the big conversation, well, they simply got the earth faded. It was nearly sundown when we mounted our horses and separated for the day. Bob Quirk returned to the post with the civilians, and I hastened back to my wagon. I had left orders with Splann to water the herd a second time during the evening, and thus ensure an easy night in holding the cattle. On my return, they were just grazing out from the river, their front a mile wide, making a pretty picture with the Yellowstone in the background. But as I sat my horse and in retrospect reviewed my connection with the cattle before me and the prospect of soon severing it, my remuda came over a nearby hill in a swinging trot for their second drink. Levering, threw them into the river below the herd and turning, galloped up to me and breathlessly asked, "Tom, did you see the dust cloud up the river? Well, the other cattle are coming. The timber cuts off your view from here. Besides, the sun's gone down. But I watched their signal for half an hour from that second hill yonder. Oh, it's cattle all right. I know the sign, even if they are 10 miles away." End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Outlet by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Soldier's Honor. Delivery day dawned with a heavy fog hanging over the valley of the Yellowstone. The frosts had ceased, and several showers had fallen during the night, one of which brought our beeves to their feet, but they gave no serious trouble and resumed their beds within an hour. There was an autumn feeling in the atmosphere, and when the sun arose, dispelling the mists, a glorious September day was ushered in. The foliage of the timber which skirted either river was coloring from recent frosts, while in numerous places the fallen leaves of the cottonwood were littering the ground. Enough rain had fallen to settle the dust, and the signal of the approaching herds, seen the evening before, was no longer visible. The delay in their appearance, however, was only temporary. I rode down to Sponsilier's camp early that morning and reported the observations of my wrangler at sundown. No one at the lower wagon had noticed the dust clouds, and someone suggested that it might be a freight outfit returning unloaded, when one of the men on herd was seen signaling the camp's notice. The attention of the day herders several miles distant was centered on some object up the river, and mounting our horses, we rode for the nearest elevation, from which 2 herds were to be seen on the opposite side, traveling in trail formation. There was no doubting their identity, and wondering what the day would bring forth, we rode for a better point of observation, when from behind a timbered bend of the river, the lead of the last herd appeared. At last the Yellowstone Valley held over 20,000 beef cattle in plain sight of each other, both factions equally determined on making the delivery on an award that required only half that number. Dismounting, we kept the herds in view for over an hour, or until the last one had crossed the river above O'Brien's roadhouse, the lead one having disappeared out of sight over on the main Missouri. This was the situation on the morning of September 15th. As we returned to Sponsilier's wagon, all the idle men about the camp joined our cavalcade, and we rode down and paid Forrest's outfit a social visit. The latter were all absent except the cook, but shortly returned from down the river and reported the opposition herds to be crossing the Missouri, evidently going to camp at Alkali Lake. "Well, I've been present at a good many deliveries," said Quince Forrest as he reined in his horse, "but this one is in a class by itself. We always aimed to get within 5 or 10 miles of a post or agency, but our friends made a worthy effort to get on the parade ground. They did the next best thing and occupied the grazing where the cavalry horses have been herded all summer. Oh, their cattle will be hog fat in a few days. Possibly they expect to show their cattle in town and not trouble the quartermaster and commandant to even saddle up. They're the very kind of people who wouldn't give anybody trouble if they could help it. It wouldn't make so much difference about those old frontier officers or a common cowman, but if one of those young lieutenants was to get his feet wet, the chances are that those Washington City contractors would fret and worry for weeks. Of course, any little inconvenience that anyone incurred on their account they'd gladly come all the way back from Europe to make it right, I don't think." While we were discussing the situation, Bob Quirk arrived at camp. He reported that Lovell, relying on the superiority of our beeves, had waived his right to deliver on the hour of high noon, and an inspection of the other cattle would be made that evening. The waiver was made at the request of the leading officers of Fort Buford, all very friendly to the best interests of the service and consequently ours, and the object was to silence all subsequent controversy. My brother admitted that some outside pressure had been brought to bear during the night, very antagonistic to the post commander, who was now more determined than ever to accept none but the best for their next year's meat supply. A well-known congressman of unsavory reputation as a lobbyist in aiding and securing government contracts for his friends was the latest addition to the legal forces of the opposition. He constantly mentioned his acquaintances in the War Department and maintained an air of assurance which was very disconcerting. The young officers in the post were abashed at the effrontery of the contractors and their legal representatives, and had even gone so far as to express doubts as to the stability of their positions in case the decision favored Lovell's cattle. Opinion was current that a possible shake-up might occur at Buford after the receipt of its beef supply, and the more timorous ones were anxious to get into the right wagon, instead of being relegated to some obscure outpost. It was now evident that the decisive issue was to occur over the delivery of the contending herds. Numerous possibilities arose in my imagination, and the various foremen advanced their views. A general belief that old man Don would fight to the last was prevalent, and amidst the discussions pro and con, I remarked that Lovell could take a final refuge behind the indemnity in hand. "Indemnity, hell," said Bob Quirk, giving me a withering look. "What is $65,000 on 10,000 beeves within an hour of delivery and at 37.5 a head? You all know that the old man has strained his credit on this summer's drive, and he's got to have the money when he goes home. A 15 or 20% indemnity does him no good. The Indian herds have paid out well, but if this delivery falls down, it will leave him holding the sack. On the other hand, if it goes through, he will be financially an independent man for life. And while he knows the danger of delay, he consented as readily as any of us would if asked for a cigarette paper. He may come out all right, but he's just about white enough to get the worst of it. I've read these Sunday school stories where the good little boy always comes out on top, but in real life, especially in cattle, it's quite different." My brother's words had a magical effect. Sponsilier asked for suggestions, when Bob urged that every man available go into the post and accompany the inspection party that afternoon. Since Forrest and himself were unknown, they would take about 3 of the boys with them, cross the Missouri, ride through and sum up the opposition cattle. Forrest approved of the idea and ordered his cook to bestir himself in getting up an early dinner. Meanwhile, a number of my boys had ridden down to Forrest's wagon, and I immediately dispatched Clay Zilligan back to my cattle to relieve Vic Wolf and inform the day herders that we might not return before dark. Wolf was the coolest man in my employ. He had figured in several shooting scrapes, and he was a splendid shot. I wanted to send him with Forrest and my brother. If identified as belonging to Lovell's outfits, there was a possibility that insult might be offered the boys, and knowing that it mattered not what the odds were, it would be resented. I thought it advisable to send a man who had smelt powder at short range. I felt no special uneasiness about my brother. In fact, he was the logical man to go. But a little precaution would do no harm, and I saw to it that Sponsilier sent a good representative. About 1 o'clock we started, 30 strong, riding down the Yellowstone. The 3 detailed men, Quince Forrest and my brother, soon bore off to the left, and we lost sight of them. Continuing on down the river, we forded the Missouri at the regular wagon crossing, and within an hour after leaving Forrest's camp, cantered into Fort Buford. Sanders and his outfit were waiting in front of the quartermaster's office, the hour for starting having been changed from 2 to 3, which afforded ample time to visit the sutler's bar. Our arrival was noticed about the barracks, and evidently some complaint had been made, as old man Don joined us in time for the first round, after which he called Dave and me aside. In reply to his inquiry regarding our presence, Sponsilier informed him that we had come in to afford him an escort in case he wished to attend the inspection of the opposition herds, that if there was any bulldozing going on, he needn't stand behind the door. Dave informed him that Bob and Quince and 3 of the other boys would meet us at the cattle, and that he need feel no hesitancy in going if it was his wish. It was quite evident that Mr. Lovell was despondent, but he took courage and announced his willingness to go along. "It was my intention not to go," said he, "though Mr. Aspgrain and Sutton both urged that I should. But now, since you boys all feel the same way, I believe I'll go. Heaven and earth are being moved to have the other cattle accepted, but there are a couple of old war horses at the head of this post that will fight them to the last ditch, and then some. I'm satisfied that my beeves in any market in the West are worth $10 a head more than the other ones. Yet there is an effort being made to turn us down. Our claim rests on 2 points: superiority of the beef tendered, and the legal impossibility of a transfer from themselves, a corporation, to themselves as individuals. If there is no outside interference, I think we will make the delivery before noon tomorrow. Now, I'll get horses for both Mr. Sutton and Senator Aspgrain, and you see that none of the boys drink too much. Sanders and his outfit are all right, and I want you lads to remind me to remember him before we leave this post. Now, we'll all go in a little party by ourselves. I don't want a word out of a man unless we are asked for an opinion from the officers, as our cattle must argue our cause." A second drink, a cigar all around, and we were ready to start. As we returned to our mounts, a bustle of activity pervaded the post. Orderlies were leading forth the best horses. Officers were appearing in riding boots and gauntlets, while 2 conveyances from a livery in town stood waiting to convey the contractors and their legal representatives. Our employer and his counsel were on hand awaiting the start when the quartermaster and his outfit led off. There was some delay among the officers over the change of a horse which had shown lameness, while the ringsters were all seated and waiting in their vehicles. Since none of us knew the trail to Alkali Lake, someone suggested that we follow up the quartermaster and allow the military and conveyances to go by the wagon road. But Lovell objected and ordered me forward to notice the trail and course, as the latter was a cut-off and much nearer than by road. I rode leisurely past the 2 vehicles, carefully scanning every face, when Mr. Field recognized and attempted to halt me. But I answered him with a contemptuous look and rode on. Instantly from the rigs came cries of "Stop that man! Halt that cowboy!" etc. When an orderly stepped in front of my horse, I reined in. But the shouting and my detention were seen and heard, and the next instant, led by Mike Sutton, our men dashed up, scaring the teams, overturning both of the conveyances, and spilling their occupants on the dusty ground. I admit that we were a hard-looking lot of cowhands. Our employer's grievance was our own, and just for an instant there was a blue, sulphuric tinge in the atmosphere as we accented our protest. The congressman scrambled to his feet, sputtering a complaint to the post commander, and when order was finally restored, the latter coolly said, "Well, Mr. Y, when did you assume command at Fort Buford? Any orders that you want to give while on this military reservation, please submit them to the proper authorities, and if just, they will receive attention. What right have you or any of your friends to stop a man without due process? I spent several hours with these men a few days ago and found them to my liking. I wish we could recruit the last one of them into our cavalry. But if you are afraid, I'll order out a troop of horses to protect you. Shall I?" "I'm not at all afraid," replied Mr. Raddiff, but feel under obligation to protect my counsel. If you please, Colonel." "Captain O'Neill," said the commandant, turning to that officer, "order out your troop and give these conveyances ample protection from now until their return from this cattle inspection. Mr. Lovell, if you wish to be present, please ride on ahead with your men. The rest of us will proceed at once, and as soon as the escort arrives, these vehicles will bring up the rear." As we rode away, the bugles were calling the troopers. "That's the way to throw the gaff into him," said Sutton, when we had ridden out of hearing. "Every time they bluff, call their hand, and they'll soon get tired of running blazers. I want to give notice right now that the first mark of disrespect shown me by client or attorney, I'll slap him then and there. I don't care if he's as big as a giant. We are up against a hard crowd, and we want to meet them a little over halfway, even on hint or insinuation. When it comes to buffaloing the opposite side, that's my long suit. The history of this case shows that the opposition has no regard for the rights of others, and it is up to us to try and teach them that a love of justice is universal. Personally, I'm nothing but a frontier lawyer from Dodge, but I'm the equal of any lobbyist that ever left Washington City." Alkali Lake was some little distance from the post. All three of the herds were holding beyond it, a polite request having reached them to vacate the grazing ground of the cavalry horses. Lovell still insisted that we stand aloof and give the constituted authorities a free, untrammeled hand until the inspection was over. The quartermaster and his assistants halted on approaching the first herd, and giving them a wide berth, we rode for the nearest good point of observation. The officers galloped up shortly afterward, reining in for a short conversation, but entering the first herd before the arrival of the conveyances and their escort. When the latter party arrived, the nearest one of the three herds had been passed upon, but the contractor stood on the carriage seats and attempted to look over the cordon of troopers, formed into a hollow square, which surrounded them. The troops were mounted on chestnut horses, making a pretty sight, and I think they enjoyed the folly and humor of the situation fully as much as we did. On nearing the second herd, we were met by the other boys, who had given the cattle a thorough going over and reported finding 2 circle-dot beeves among the opposition steers. The chances are that they had walked off a bed ground some night while holding at Ogallala and had been absorbed into another herd before morning. My brother announced his intention of taking them back with us, when Sponsilier taunted him with the fact that there might be objections offered. "That'll be all right, Davy," said Bob. "It'll take a bigger and better outfit than these pimps and tin horns to keep me from claiming my own. You just watch and notice if those 2 steers don't go back with Forrest. Why, they had the nerve to question our right even to look them over. It must be a trifle dull with the girls down there in Ogallala when all these babies have to turn out at work or go hungry." Little time was lost in inspecting the last herd. The cattle were thrown entirely too close together to afford much opportunity in looking them over, and after riding through them a few times, the officers rode away for a consultation. We had kept at a distance from the convoy, perfectly contented so long as the opposition were prisoners of their own choosing. Captain O'Neill evidently understood the wishes of his superior officer, and never once were his charges allowed within hailing distance of the party of inspection. As far as exerting any influence was concerned, for that matter, all of us might have remained back at the post and received the report on the commander's return. Yet there was a tinge of uncertainty as to the result, and all concerned wanted to hear it at the earliest moment. The inspection party did not keep us long in waiting, for after a brief conference, they turned and rode for the contractors under escort. We rode forward, the troop closed up in close formation about the 2 vehicles, and the general tension rose to that of rigidity. We halted quietly, within easy hearing distance, and without noticing us, the commandant addressed himself to the occupants of the conveyances, who were now standing on the seats. "Gentlemen," said he with military austerity, "the quality and condition of your cattle places them beyond our consideration. Beef intended for delivery at this post must arrive here with sufficient flesh to withstand the rigors of our winter. When possible to secure them, we prefer northern wintered cattle, but if they are not available, we are compelled to receive southern ones. They must be of the first quality in conformation and flesh. It now becomes my duty to say to you that your beeves are rough, have been overdriven, are tender-footed, and otherwise abused, and having in view the best interests of the service, with the concurrence of my associates, I decline them." The decision was rendered amid breathless silence. Not a word of exultation escaped one of our party, but the nervous strain rather intensified. Mr. Y, the congressman, made the first move. Quietly alighting from the vehicle, he held a whispered conversation with his associates, very composedly turned to the commandant and said, "No doubt you are aware that there are higher authorities than the post commander and quartermaster of Fort Buford. The higher court to which I refer saw fit to award a contract for 5,000,000 pounds of beef to be delivered at this post on foot. Any stipulations inserted or omitted in that article, the customary usage of the War Department would govern. If you will kindly look at the original contract, a copy of which is in your possession, you will notice that nothing is said about the quality of the cattle, just so the pounds avoirdupois are there. The government does not presume when contracting for Texas cattle that they will arrive here in perfect order, but so long as the sex, age, and weight have been complied with, there can be no evasion of the contract. My clients are subcontractors under the assignment of the original award, and are acting in good faith in making this tender. And if your decision is against them, we will make an appeal to the War Department. I am not presuming to tell you your duty, but trust you will take this matter under full advisement before making your decision final." "Mr. Y, I have received cattle before without any legal advice or interference of higher authority. Although you have ignored his presence, there is another man here with a tender of beef who is entitled to more than passing consideration. He holds a subcontract under the original award, and there is no doubt but he is also acting in good faith. My first concern as a receiving agent of this government is that the goods tendered must be of the first quality. Your cattle fall below our established standards here, while his will rank as the finest lot of beeves ever tendered at this post, and therefore he is entitled to the award. I am not going to stand on any technicalities as to who is legally entitled to make this delivery. There have been charges and countercharges which have reached me, the justice of which I cannot pass on. But with the cattle it is quite different. I lack but 5 years of being retired on my rank, the greater portion of which service has been spent on this frontier, and I feel justified in the decision made. The government buys the best, insists on its receiving agents demanding the same, and what few remaining years I serve the flag, there will be no change in my policy." There was a hurried conference. The major domo was called into the consultation, after which the congressman returned to the attack. "Colonel, you are forcing us to make a protest to the War Department. As commander at Fort Buford, what right have you to consider the tender of any Tom, Dick, or Harry who may have cattle to sell? Armed with an assignment of the original award, we have tendered you the pounds quantity required by the existing contract, have insisted on the acceptance of the same, and if refused, our protest will be in the War Office before the sun sets. Now, my advice is—" "I don't give a damn for you nor your advice. My reputation as a soldier is all I possess, and no man can dictate to nor intimidate me. My past record is an open book, and one which I am proud of, and while I have the honor to command at Fort Buford, no threats can terrify nor cause me to deviate from my duty. Captain O'Neill, attend orders and escort these vehicles back to their quarters." The escort loosened out, the conveyances started, and the inspection was over. We were a quiet crowd, though inwardly we felt like shouting. We held apart from the military party, and when near the herd which held the Circle Dot steers, my brother and a number of the boys galloped on ahead and cut out the animals before our arrival. On entering the wagon road near the post, the military cavalcade halted a moment for us to come up. Lovell was in the lead, and as we halted, the commandant said to him, "We have decided to receive your cattle in the morning, about 10 o'clock, if that hour will be convenient. I may not come over, but the quartermaster's Mr. Sanders will count for us, and your cowmen ought to agree on the numbers. We have delayed you a day, and if you will put in a bill for demurrage, I will approve it. I believe that is all. We expect you to spend the night with us at the post. I thought it best to advise you now, so that you might give your men any final orders." End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Outlet by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Kangarooed. Lovell and his attorneys joined the cavalcade which returned to the post, while we continued on south, fording the Missouri above Forrest's camp. The 2 recovered beeves were recognized by their ranch brands as belonging in B County, thus identifying them as having escaped from Bob Quirk's herd, though he had previously denied all knowledge of them. The cattle world was a small one, and it mattered little where an animal roamed. There was always a man nearby who could identify the brand and give the bovine's past history. With the prospects bright for a new owner on the morrow, these 2 wayfarers found lodgment among our own for the night. But when another day dawned, it brought new complications. Instead of the early arrival of any receiving party, the appointed hour passed, noon came, and no one appeared. I had ridden down to the lower camps about the latter hour, yet there was no one who could explain. Neither had any word from the post reached Forrest's wagon. Sponsilier suggested that we ride into Buford, and accordingly all 3 of us foremen started. When we sighted the ford on the Missouri, a trio of horsemen were just emerging from the water, and we soon were in possession of the facts. Sanders, my brother, and Mike Sutton composed the party, and the latter explained the situation. Orders from the War Department had reached Fort Buford that morning, temporarily suspending the post commander and his quartermaster from receiving any cattle intended for that post, and giving notice that a special commissioner was then en route from Minneapolis with full authority in the premises. The order was signed by the first quartermaster and approved by the head of that department. There was no going behind it, which further showed the strength that the opposition were able to command. The little attorney was wearing his war paint, and we all dismounted, when Sanders volunteered some valuable points on the wintering of Texas cattle in the North. Sutton made a memorandum of the data, saying if opportunity offered, he would like to submit it in evidence at the final hearing. The general opinion was that a court of inquiry would be instituted, and if such was the case, our cause was not by any means hopeless. The chances are that the opposition will center the fight on an assignment of the original contract which they claim to hold, said the lawyer in conclusion. The point was advanced yesterday that we were intruders, while on the other hand, the government was in honor bound to recognize its outstanding obligation, no matter in whose hands it was presented, so long as it was accompanied by the proper tender. A great deal will depend on the viewpoint of this special commissioner. He may be a stickler for red tape, with no concern for the service, as were the post commander and quartermaster. Their possession of the original document will be self-evident, and it will devolve on us to show that the assignment was illegal. This may not be as easy as it seems, for the chances are that there may be a dozen men in the gang, with numerous stool pigeons ready and willing to do their bidding. This contract may demonstrate the possibility of a ring within a ring, with everything working to the same end. The absence of honest John Griscom at this delivery is significant, as proving that his presence at Dodge and Ogallala was a mistake. You notice with the exception of Field and Radcliffe, that they are all new men. Well, another day will tell the story. The special commissioner could not arrive before the next morning. An ambulance with relay teams had left the post at daybreak for Glendive and would return that night. Since the following promised to be a decisive day, we were requested to bring every available man and report at Fort Buford at an early hour. The trio returned to the post and we foremen to our herds. My outfit received the news in anything but a cheerful mood. The monotony of the long drive had made the men restless, and the delay of a single day in being finally relieved, when looked forward to, was doubly exasperating. It had been over 6 months since we left the ranch in Medina, and there was a lurking suspicion among a number of the boys that the final decision would be against our cattle and that they would be thrown back on our hands. There was a general anxiety among us to go home, hastened by the recent frosty nights and a common fear of a northern climate. I tried to stem this feeling, promising a holiday on the morrow and assuring everyone that we still had a fighting chance. We reached the post at a timely hour the next morning. Only 3 men were left with each herd, my wrangler and cook accompanying us for the day. Parent held forth with quite a dissertation on the legal aspects of the case, and after we forded the river, an argument arose between him and Jake Blair. "Don't talk to me about what's legal and what isn't," said the latter. "The man with a pull generally gets all that he goes after. You remember the Indian and the white man were at a loss to know how to divide the turkey and the buzzard, but in the end, poor man got the buzzard. And if you'll just pay a little more attention to humanity, you may notice that the legal aspects don't cut so much figure as you thought they did. The moment the cattle declined $5 to $7 a head, the Western Supply Company didn't trouble themselves as to the legality or the right or wrong, but proceeded to take advantage of the situation at once. Neil, when you've lived about 25 years on the cold charity of strangers, you'll get over that blind confidence and become wary and cunning. It might be a good idea to keep your eye open today for your first lesson. Anyhow, don't rely too strong on the right or justice of anything, but keep a good horse on picket and your powder dry." The commissioner had arrived early that morning and would take up matters at once. 9 o'clock was set for the hearing, which would take place in the quartermaster's office. Consultations were being held among the 2 factions, and the only ray of light was the reported frigidity of the special officer. He was such a superior personage that ordinary mortals felt a chill radiating from his person on their slightest approach. His credentials were from the War Department, and were such as to leave no doubt but that he was the autocrat of the situation, before whom all should render homage. A rigid military air prevailed about the post and grounds, quite out of the ordinary, while the officers' bar was empty and silent. The quartermaster's office would comfortably accommodate about 100 persons. Fort Buford had been rebuilt in 1871, the adobe buildings giving place to frame structures, and the room in which the hearing was to be held was not only commodious but furnished with good taste. Promptly on the stroke of the hour, and escorted by the post adjutant, the Grand Mogul made his appearance. There was nothing striking about him except his military bearing. He was rather young and walked so erect that he actually leaned backwards a trifle. There was no prelude. He ordered certain tables rearranged, seated himself at one, and called for a copy of the original contract. The post adjutant had all the papers covering the situation in hand, and the copy was placed at the disposal of the special commissioner, who merely glanced at the names of the contracting parties, amount and date, and handed the document back. Turning to the table at which Lovell and his attorneys sat, he asked for the credentials under which they were tendering beeves at Fort Buford. The subcontract was produced, some slight memorandum was made, and it was passed back as readily as was the original. The opposition were calmly awaiting a similar request, and when it came, in offering the papers, Congressman Y took occasion to remark, "Our tender is not only on a subcontract, but that agreement is fortified by an assignment of the original award by and between the War Department and the Western Supply Company. We rely on the latter. You will find everything regular." The customary glance was given the bulky documents. Senator Aspgrain was awaiting the opportune moment to attack the assignment. When it came, the senator arose with dignity and, addressing the commissioner, attempted to enter a protest, but was instantly stopped by that high functionary. A frozen silence pervaded the room. "There is no occasion for any remarks in this matter," austerely replied the government specialist. "Our department regularly awarded the beef contract for this post to the Western Supply Company. There was ample competition on the award, insuring the government against exorbitant prices, and the required bonds were furnished for the fulfillment of the contract. Right then and there, all interest upon the part of the grantors ceased until the tender was made at this post on the appointed day of delivery. In the interim, however, it seems that for reasons purely their own, the grantees saw fit to sublet their contract not once but twice. Our department amply protected themselves by requiring bonds, and the subcontractors should have done the same. That, however, is not the matter at issue, but who is entitled to deliver on the original award. Fortunately, that point is beyond question. An assignment of the original has always been recognized at the War Office, and in this case the holders of the same are declared entitled to deliver. There is only one provision. Does the article of the beef tendered qualify under the specifications? That is the only question before making this decision final. If there is any evidence to the contrary, I am ready to hear it." This afforded the opportunity of using Sanders as a witness, and Sutton grasped the opportunity of calling him to testify in regard to wintering Southern cattle in the North. After stating his qualifications as a citizen and present occupation, he was asked by the commissioner regarding his experience with cattle to entitle his testimony to consideration. "I was born to the occupation in Texas," replied the witness. 5 years ago this summer I came with beef cattle from Uvalde County, that state, to this post, and after the delivery accepted a situation under the quartermaster here in locating and holding the government beeves. At the present I am foreman and have charge of all cattle delivered at or issued from this post. I have had 5 years' experience in wintering Texas cattle in this vicinity, and have no hesitancy in saying that it is a matter of the utmost importance that steers should be in the best possible flesh to withstand our winters. The losses during the most favorable seasons have averaged from 1 to 5%, while the same cattle in severe seasons will lose from 10 to 25, all depending on the condition of the stock with the beginning of cold weather. Since my connection with this post, we have always received good steers, and our losses have been light, but above and below this military reservation, the percent loss has run as high as 50 among thin, weak animals." "Now, Mr. Sanders," said the special commissioner, "as an expert, you are testifying as to the probable loss to the government in this locality in buying and holding beef on its own account. You may now state if you have seen the tender of beef made by Field, Ratcliffe & Company, and if so, anticipating the worst, what would be the probable loss if their cattle were accepted on this year's delivery." "I was present at their inspection by the officers of this post," replied the witness, "and have no hesitancy in saying that should the coming one prove as hard a winter as '82 was, there would be a loss of fully one half these cattle. At least that was my opinion as expressed to the post commander and quartermaster at their inspection, and they agreed with me. There are half a dozen other boys here whose views on wintering cattle can be had, and they're worth listening to." This testimony was the brutal truth, and though eternal, was sadly out of place. The opposition lawyers winced, and when Sutton asked if permission would be given to hear the testimony of the post commander and quartermaster, both familiar with the quality of the cattle the government had been receiving for years, the commissioner, having admitted damaging testimony, objected on the grounds that they were under suspension. and military men were not considered specialists outside their own vocation. Other competent witnesses were offered and objected to, simply because they would not admit they were experts. Taking advantage of the opening, Congressman Y called attention to a few facts in passing. This unfortunate situation, he said in substance, was deeply regretted by his clients and himself. The War Department was to be warmly commended for sending a special commissioner to hear the matter at issue. Otherwise, unjust charges might have been preferred against old and honored officers in the service. However, if specialists were to be called to testify and their testimony considered as to what % of cattle would survive a winter, why not call on the weather prophets to testify just what the coming one would be? He ridiculed the attestation of Sanders as irrelevant, defiantly asserting that the only question at issue was whether 5 million pounds of dressed beef in the tender of cattle by Field, Radcliffe and Company. He insisted on the letter in the bond being observed. The government bought cattle one year with another and assumed risks, as did other people. Was there any man present to challenge his assertion that the pounds quantity had been tendered? There was. Don Lovell rose and, addressing the special commissioner, said, "Sir, I am not giving my opinion as an expert, but as a practical cowman. If the testimony of one who has delivered over 90,000 cattle to this government in its Army and Indian departments is of any service to you, I trust you will hear me patiently. No exception is taken to your ruling as to who is entitled to deliver on the existing award. That was expected from the first. I have been contracting beef to this government for the past 15 years, and there may be tricks in the trade of which I am ignorant. The Army has always demanded the best, while lower grades have always been acceptable to the Indian Department. But in all my experience, I have never tendered this government for its gut-eating wards as poor a lot of cattle as I am satisfied that you are going to receive at the hands of Field, Radcliffe and Company. I accept the challenge that there are not 5 million pounds of dressed beef in the tender today, and what there is would be a disgrace to any commonwealth to feed its convicts. True, these cattle are not intended for immediate use, and I make the counter assertion that this government will never kill out 50% of the weight that you accept today. Possibly you prefer the blandishments of a lobbyist to the opinion of a practical cowman like Sanders. That's your privilege. You refuse to allow us to show the relationship between the Western Supply Company and the present holders of its assignment, and in doing so, I charge you with being in collusion with these contractors to defraud the government." "You're a liar," shouted Congressman Y, jumping to his feet. The only reply was a chair hurled from the hand of Sutton at the head of the offender, instantly followed by a roughhouse. Several officers present sprang to the side of the special commissioner, but fortunately refrained from drawing revolvers. I was standing at some distance from the table, and as I made a lunge forward, old man Don was hurled backward into my arms. He could not whip a sick chicken, yet his uncontrollable anger had carried him into the general melee, and he had been roughly thrown out by some of his own men. They did not want him in the fight. They could do all that was necessary. A number of soldiers were present, and while the officers were frantically commanding them to restore order, the scrap went merrily on. Old man Don struggled with might and main, cursing me for refusing to free him, and when one of the contractors was knocked down within easy reach, I was half tempted to turn him loose. The major domo had singled out Sponsilier and was trying issues with him. Bob Quirk was dropping them right and left when the deposed commandant sprang upon a table and in a voice like the hiss of an adder commanded peace, and the disorder instantly ceased. The row had lasted only a few seconds. The opposing sides stood glaring daggers at each other when the commissioner took occasion to administer a reproof to all parties concerned, referring to Texas in not very complimentary terms. Dave Sponsilier was the only one who had the temerity to offer any reply, saying, "Mr. Yank, I'll give you $100 if you'll point out the grave of a man, woman, or child who starved to death in that state." A short recess was taken, after which apologies followed, and the commissioner resumed the hearing. A Western lawyer named Lamoureux made a very plausible plea for the immediate acceptance of the tender of Field, Radcliffe and Company. He admitted the cattle at present were not in as good flesh as his clients expected to offer them, that they had left the Platte River in fine condition, but had been twice quarantined en route. He was cautious in his remarks, but clearly intimated that had there been no other cattle in competition for delivery on this award, there might have been no quarantine. In his insinuations, the facts were adroitly brought out that the isolation of their herds, if not directly chargeable to Lovell and his men, had been aided and abetted by them, retarding the progress of his clients' beeves and forcing them to travel as fast as 25 miles a day, so that they arrived in a jaded condition. Had there been no interference, the tender of Field, Radcliffe and Company would have reached this post 10 days earlier, and the rest would soon have restored the cattle to their normal condition. In concluding, he boldly made the assertion that the condition of his client's tender of beef was the result of a conspiracy to injure one firm, that another drover might profit thereby, that right and justice could be conserved only by immediately making the decision final, and thus fearlessly silencing any and all imputations reflecting on the character of this government's trusted representatives. The special commissioner assumed an air of affected dignity and announced that a conclusion had been arrived at. Turning to old man Don, he expressed his deepest regret that a civilian was beyond his power to punish, otherwise he would have cause to remember the affront offered himself. Not that he personally cared, but the department of government which he had the honor to serve was jealous of its good name. Under the circumstances, he could only warn him to be more guarded hereafter in choosing his language, and assured Lovell that it was in his power to escort any offender off that military reservation. Pausing a moment, he resumed the judicial air and summed up the situation. "There was no occasion," said he in an amiable mood, "to refer this incident to the War Department if the authorities here had gone about their work properly. Fortunately, I was in Minneapolis adjusting some flour accounts when I was ordered here by the Quartermaster General. Instead of attempting to decide who had the best tender of cattle, the one with the legal right alone should have been considered. Our department is perfectly familiar with these petty jealousies, which usually accompany awards of this class, and generally emanate from disappointed and disgruntled competitors. The point is well taken by counsel that the government does not anticipate the unforeseen, and it matters not what the loss may be from the rigors of winter. The contractor is exempt after the day of delivery. If the cattle were delayed en route, as has been asserted, and it was necessary to make forced drives in order to reach here within the specified time, all this should have been taken into consideration in arriving at a final conclusion. On his reinstatement, I shall give the quartermaster of this post instructions, in receiving these cattle, to be governed not so much by their present condition as by what they would have been had there been no interference. Now, in behalf of the War Department, I declare the award to the Western Supply Company and assign the Field, Radcliffe and Associates to have been fulfilled to the satisfaction of all parties concerned. This closes the incident, and if there is nothing further, the inquiry will stand adjourned without date." "One moment, if you please," said Don Lovell, addressing the commissioner and contractors. "There is a private matter existing between Field, Radcliffe and Company and myself, which demands an understanding between us. I hold a sum of money belonging to them as indemnity against loss in driving 10,000 cattle from southern Texas to this post. That I will sustain a heavy loss under your decision is beyond question. I am indemnified to the amount of about $6.50 a head, and since the government is exempt from garnishment and the contractors are wholly irresponsible, I must content myself with the money in hand. To recover this amount, held as indemnity, Suit has been threatened against me. Of course, I can't force their hands, but I sincerely hope they will feel exultant enough over your kangaroo decision to file their action before taking their usual outing in Europe. They will have no trouble in securing my legal address. My rating can be obtained from any commercial agency, and no doubt their attorneys are aware of the statute of limitations in my state. I believe that's all, except to extend my thanks to everyone about Fort Buford for the many kind attentions shown my counsel, my boys, and myself. To my enemies, I can only say that I hope to meet them on Texas soil, and will promise them a fairer hearing than was accorded me here today. Mr. Commissioner, I have always prided myself on being a good citizen, have borne arms in defense of my country, and in taking exception to your decision, I brand you the most despicable member of the Western Supply Company. Any man who will prostitute a trust for a money consideration. That's enough, shouted the special commissioner, rising. Orderly, call the officer of the day and tell him I want 2 companies of cavalry to furnish an escort for this man and his herds beyond the boundary of this military reservation. Looking Lovell in the face, he said, "You have justly merited a severe punishment, and I shall report your reflections to the War and Indian departments, and you may find it more difficult to secure contracts in the future. One of you officers detail men and take charge of this man until the escort is ready. The inquiry is adjourned." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Outlet by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Winter of Our Discontent. The inquiry was over before noon. A lieutenant detailed a few men and made a pretense of taking possession of Lovell. But once the special commissioner was out of sight, the farce was turned into an ovation, and nearly every officer in the post came forward and extended his sympathy. Old Man Don was visibly affected by the generous manifestations of the military men in general, and after thanking each one personally, urged that no unnecessary demonstration should be made, begging that the order of the escort beyond the boundary of the reservation be countermanded. No one present cared to suggest it, but gave assurance that it would be so modified as not in any way to interfere with the natural movement of the herds. Some little time would be required to outfit the forage wagons to accommodate the cavalry companies, during which my brother rode up leading Lovell's horse. Permission was given to leave in advance of the escort, and we all mounted and quietly rode away. The sudden turn of affairs had disconcerted every man in the 3 outfits. Just what the next move would be was conjecture with most of us, though every lad present was anxious to know. But when we were beyond the immediate grounds, Lovell turned in his saddle and asked which one of us foremen wanted the winter in the north. No one volunteered, and Old Man Don continued, anticipating the worst. I had a long talk this morning with Sanders, and he assured me that our cattle would go through any winter without serious loss. He suggested the Little Missouri as a good range, and told me of a hay ranch below the mouth of the Beaver. If it can be bought reasonably, we would have forage for our horses, and the railroad is said to be not over 40 miles to the south. If the government can afford to take the risk of wintering cattle in this climate, since there is no other choice, I reckon I'll have to follow suit. Bob and I will take fresh horses and ride through to the Beaver this afternoon, and you fellows follow up leisurely with the cattle. Sanders says the winters are dry and cold, with very little, if any, snowfall. Well, we're simply up against it. There's no hope of selling this late in the season, and nothing is left us but to face the music of a northern winter. As we turned in to ford the Missouri, someone called attention to a cavalry company riding out from their quarters at the post. We halted a moment, and as the first one entered the road, the second one swung into view, followed by forage wagons. From maps in our possession, we knew that the southern boundary of the Fort Buford military reservation must be under 20 miles to the south, and if necessary, we could put it behind us that afternoon. But after crossing the river, and when the two troops again came in view, they had dropped into a walk, passing entirely out of sight long before we reached Forrest's camp. Orders were left with the latter to take the lead and make a short drive that evening, at least far enough to convince observers that we were moving. The different outfits dropped out as their wagons were reached, and when my remuda was sighted, old man Don ordered it brought in for a change of horses. One of the day herders was at camp getting dinner, and inviting themselves to join him, my employer and my brother helped themselves while their saddles were shifted to two of my well-rested mounts. Inquiry had been made of all three of the outfits if any ranch had been sighted on the Beaver while crossing that creek, but the only recollection among the 40-odd men was that of Burl Van Vetter, who contended that a dim trail over which horses had passed that summer ran down on the south side of the stream. With this meager information, Lovell and my brother started. A late dinner over, and the herders relieved, we all rode for the nearest eminence, which would afford us a view. The cavalry were just going into camp below O'Brien's ranch, their forage train in sight, while Forrest's cattle were well bunched and heading south. Sponsilier was evidently going to start, as his team was tied up and the saddle stock in hand, while the herd was crossing over to the eastern side of the Yellowstone. We dismounted and lay around for an hour or so, when the greater portion of the boys left to help in the watering of our herd, the remainder of us doing outpost duty. Forrest had passed out of sight. Sponsilier's wagon and remuda crossed opposite us, going up the valley, followed by his cattle in loose grazing order, and still we loitered on the hill. But towards evening I rode down to where the cavalry was encamped, and before I had conversed very long with the officers, it was clear to me that the shorter our moves, the longer it would extend their outing. Before I left the soldiers' camp, Sanders arrived, and as we started away together, I sent him back to tell the officers to let me know any time they could use half a beef. On reaching our wagon, the boys were just corralling the saddle stock for their night horses, when Sanders begged me to sell him two which had caught his fancy. I dared not offer them, but remembering the fellow's faithful service in our behalf, and that my employer expected to remember him, I ordered him to pick, with Don Lovell's compliments, any horse in the remuda as a present. The proposition stunned Sanders, but I insisted that if old man Don was there, he would make him take something. He picked a good horse out of my mount and stayed until morning, when he was compelled to return, as the probabilities were that they would receive the other cattle sometime during the day. After breakfast, as he was starting to return, he said, "Well, boys, tell the old man that I don't expect ever to be able to return his kindness, though I'd ride 1,000 miles for the chance. One thing's sure, there isn't a man in Dakota who has money enough to tempt me to part with my pilon. If you locate down in the Little Missouri, drop me a line where you are at, and if Lovell wants 4 good men, I can let him have them about the 1st of December. You through lads are liable to be scared over the coming winter, and a few acclimated ones will put backbone in his outfit. And tell the old man that if I can ever do him a good turn, just to snap his fingers, and I'll quit the government. He's a few shades whiter than it, anyhow." The herd had already left the bed ground headed south. About 5 miles above O'Brien's, we recrossed to the eastern side of the Yellowstone, and for the next 3 days moved short distances. The military always camped well in our rear. The 4th morning I killed a beef. A forage wagon came forward and took half of it back to the cavalry camp with our greetings and farewell, and we parted company. Don Lovell met us about noon, elated as a boy over his purchase of the hay ranch. My brother had gone on to the railroad, and thence by train to Miles City to meet his remuda and outfit. "Boys, I bought you a new home," was the greeting from old man Don, as he dismounted at our noon camp. There's a comfortable dugout, stabling for about 10 horses and 75 tons of good hay in the stack. The owner was homesick to get back to God's country, and he'll give us possession in 10 days. Bob will be in Little Missouri today and order us a car of sacked corn from Omaha, and within a month we'll be as snug as they are down in old Medina. Bob's outfit will go home from Miles, and if he can't sell his remuda, he'll bring it up here. 2 of these outfits can start back in a few days, and afterwards the camp will be reduced to 10 men. 2 days later, Forrest veered off and turned his cattle loose below the junction of the Beaver with the Little Missouri. Sponsilier crossed the former, scattering his beeves both up and down the latter, while I cut mine into a dozen bunches and likewise freed them along the creek. The range was about 10 miles in length along the river, and a camp was established at either end where men would be stationed until the beeves were located. The commissaries had run low. There was quite a rivalry as to which outfits should go home, and we all waited with bated breath for the final word. I had Dorg Say secretly inform my employer that I had given Sanders a horse without his permission, hoping that it might displease him. But the others pointed out the fact that my outfit had far the best remuda, and that it would require well-mounted men to locate and hold the number of cattle through the winter. Old man Don listened to them all, and the next morning all 3 of us foremen were outlining certain improvements about the hay ranch with him when he turned to me and said, "Tom, I hear you gave Sanders a horse. Well, that was all right, although it strikes me you were rather liberal in giving him the pick of a choice remuda. But it may come right in the long run, as Bob and I have decided to leave you and your outfit to hold these cattle this winter. So divide your men and send half of them down to Quince's camp, and have your cook and wrangler come over to Dave's wagon to bring back provisions and the horses, and we'll start for the railroad in the morning. I may not come back, but Bob will, and he'll see that you are well fixed for the winter before he goes home. After he leaves, I want you to write me every chance you have to send a letter to the railroad. Now, I don't want any grumbling out of you or your men. You're a disgrace to the state that raised you if you can't handle cattle anywhere that any other man can." I felt all along it would fall to me, the youngest of 6 foremen, and my own dear brother consigning me to a winter in the North while he would bask in the sunshine of our own sunny South. It was hard to face, but I remembered that the fall before it had been my lot to drive 1,000 saddle horses home to the ranch, and that I had swaggered as a trail foreman afterward as a result. It had always been my luck to have to earn every little advance or promotion, while others seemed to fall into them without any effort. Bob Quirk never saw the day that he was half the all-round cowman that I was, yet he was above me and could advise, and I had to obey. On the morning of the 25th of September, 1884, the 2 outfits started for the railroad, leaving the remainder of us in a country, save for the cattle, so desolate that there was no chance even to spend our wages. I committed to memory a curtain lecture for my brother, though somehow or other it escaped me and was never delivered. We rode lines between the upper and lower wagons, holding the cattle loosely on a large range. A delightful fall favored us, and before the first squall of winter came on, the beeves had contented themselves as though they had been born on the Little Missouri. Meanwhile, Bob's wagon and remuda arrived. The car of corn was hauled to our headquarters. Extra stabling was built, and we settled down like banished exiles. Communication had been opened with Fort Buford, and in the latter part of October the 4 promised men arrived, when Bob Quirk took part of my outfit and went home, leaving me 10 men. Parent remained as cook. The new men assimilated easily. A fiddle was secured, and in fulfillment of the assertion of Sanders, we picked up courage. 2 grain-fed horses carefully stabled were allowed to each man. The remainder of our large number of saddle stock running free on the range. To that long winter on the Little Missouri, a relentless memory turns in retrospect. We dressed and lived like Eskimos. The first blizzard struck us early in December. The thermometer dropped 60 degrees in 12 hours, but in the absence of wind and snow, the cattle did not leave the breaks along the river. 3 weeks later, a second one came, and we could not catch the lead animals until near the railroad. But the storm drove them up the Little Missouri, and its sheltering banks helped us to check our worst winter drift. After the first month of wintry weather, the dread of the cold passed, and men and horses faced the work as though it was springtime in our own loved Southland. The months rolled by scarcely noticed. During fine weather, Sanders and some of his boys twice dropped down for a few days, but we never left the camp except to send letters home. An early spring favored us. I was able to report less than 1% loss on the home range, with the possibility of but few cattle having escaped us during the winter. The latter part of May we sold 400 saddle horses to some men from the upper Yellowstone. Early in June, a wagon was rigged out, extra men employed, and an outfit sent 200 miles up the Little Missouri to attend the roundups. They were gone a month and came in with less than 500 beeves, which represented our winter drift. Don Lovell reached the ranch during the first week in July. One day's ride through the splendid cattle, and old man Don lost his voice, but the smile refused to come off. Everything was coming his way. Field, Radcliffe and Company had sued him, and the jury awarded him $100,000. His bankers had unlimited confidence in his business ability. He had 4 Indian herds on the trail and 3 others of younger steers intended for the Little Missouri ranch. Cattle prices in Texas had depreciated nearly 1/2 since the spring before. A good time for every cowman to strain his credit and enlarge his holdings, my employer assured me. Orders were left that I was to begin shipping out the beeves early in August. It was the intention to ship them in 2 and 3 trainload lots, and I was expecting to run a double outfit when a landslide came our way. The first trainload netted $60 a head at Omaha, but they were beeves, cods like an ox's heart, and waddled as they walked. We had just returned from the railroad with the intention of shipping 2 trainloads more when the quartermaster and Sanders from Fort Buford rode into the ranch under an escort. The government had lost 40% of the Field Radcliffe cattle during the winter just past, and were in the market to buy the deficiency. The quartermaster wanted 1,000 beeves on the first day of September and October each, and double that number for the next month. Did we care to sell that amount? A United States Marshal armed with a search warrant could not have found Don Lovell in a month, but they were promptly assured that our beef steers were for sale. It is easy to show prime cattle. The quartermaster, Sanders, and myself rode down the river, crossed over, and came up beyond our camp, forded back, and came down the Beaver, and I knew the sale was made. I priced the beeves delivered at Buford at $65 a head, and the quartermaster took them. Then we went to work in earnest. Sanders remained to receive the first contingent for Buford, which would leave our range on the 25th of each month. A single roundup, and we had the beeves in hand. The next morning after Splann left for the mouth of the Yellowstone, I started south for the railroad with 2 trainloads of picked cattle. Professional shippers took them off our hands at the station, accompanied them en route to market, and the commission house in Omaha knew where to remit the proceeds. The beef shipping season was on with a vengeance. Our saddle stock had improved with the winter in the north, until one was equal to 2 southern or trail horses. Old man Don had come on in the meantime, and was so pleased with my sale to the army post that he returned to Little Missouri Station at once and bought 2 herds of 3-year-olds at Ogallala by wire. That made 16,000 steer cattle en route from the latter point for Lovell's new ranch in Dakota. "Tom," said old man Don enthusiastically, "this is the making of a fine cattle ranch, and we want to get in on the flood tide. There is always a natural wealth in a new country, and the gold mines of this one are in its grass. The instinct that taught the buffalo to choose this as their summer and winter range was unerring, and they found grass at hand that would sustain them in any and all kinds of weather. This country today is just what Texas was 30 years ago. All the early settlers at home grew rich without any effort, but once the cream of the virgin land is gone, look out for a change. The early cowmen of Texas flattered themselves on being shrewd and far-seeing, just about as much as I was last fall, when I would gladly have lost $25,000 rather than winter these cattle. Now look where I will come out, all due to the primitive wealth of the land. From $60 to $65 a head beats 37.5 for our time and trouble. The first of the through cattle arrived early in September. They avoided our range for fear of fever, and dropped in about 15 miles below our headquarters on the Little Missouri. Dorg Say was one of the 3 foremen, Forrest and Sponsilier being the other 2, having followed the same route as our herds of the year before. But having spent a winter in the north, we showed the through outfits a chilling contempt. I had ribbed up Parent not even to give them a pleasant word about our wagon or headquarters, and particularly if Bob Quirk came through with one of the purchased herds. He was to be given the marble heart. One outfit loose herded the new cattle, the other 2 going home, and about the middle of the month my brother and the rebel came trailing in with the last 2 herds. I was delighted to meet my old bunkie, and had him remain over until the last outfit went home, when we reluctantly parted company. Not so, however, with Bob Quirk, who haughtily informed me that he came near slapping my cook for his effrontery. "So you are another one of those lousy through outfits that think we ought to make a fuss over you, are you?" I retorted. "Just you wait until we do. Every one of you except old Paul had the idea that we ought to give you a reception and ask you to sleep in our beds. I'm glad that Parent had the gumption to give you a mean look. He'll ride for me next year." The month of October finished the shipping. There was a magic in that northern climate that wrought wonders in an animal from the south. Little wonder that the buffalo could face the blizzard in a country of his own choosing, and in a climate where the frost king held high revel 5 months out of the 12. There was a tonic like the iron of wine in the atmosphere, absorbed alike by man and beast, and its possessor laughed at the fury of the storm. Our loss of cattle during the first winter, traceable to season, was insignificant, while we sold out over 200 head more than the accounts called for, due to the presence of strays, which went to Buford. And when the last beef was shipped, the final delivery concluded to the Army, Don Lovell was $250,000 to the good, over and above the contract price at which he had failed to deliver the same cattle to the government the fall before. As foreman of Lovell's beef ranch on the Little Missouri, I spent 5 banner years of my life. In '89, the stock, goodwill, and range were sold to a cattle syndicate, who installed a superintendent and posted rules for the observance of its employees. I do not care to say why, but in a stranger's hands it never seemed quite the same home to a few of us who were present when it was transformed into a cattle range. Late that fall, some half a dozen of us who were from Texas asked to be relieved and returned to the South. A traveler passing through that country today will hear the section about the mouth of the Beaver called only by the syndicate name, but old-timers will always lovingly refer to it as the Don Lovell Ranch. End of chapter 24. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of The Outlet by Andy Adams.